Midnight runs were my specialty, especially that stretch of I-40 through Arizona, where you could drive for hours without seeing another soul. Been hauling refrigerated goods for 12 years, and after my daughter turned 18 and moved to college, those long nights on the road became my escape from an empty house. That particular September night started like any other, with me pulling a load of pharmaceuticals from Phoenix to Oklahoma City, the kind of high-value cargo that paid well but came with strict security protocols. My Peterbilt was my second home, equipped with everything I needed for a week on the road, including a comfortable sleeper bunk that I'd customized with extra locks and a small safe for my personal items. Around 2 in the morning, I pulled into a rest area near Flagstaff to update my logbook and stretch my legs, the kind of place where the overhead lights barely worked and the vending machines hadn't been restocked since the Clinton administration. Standing near the entrance ramp was this guy, maybe 45, wearing clean Carhartt work clothes and steel-toed boots that actually looked broken in from real labor. He approached my rig while I was checking the trailer seals, holding up a worn leather work bag and explaining how his ride to the copper mine had left him behind after a bathroom break, and if he missed his shift supervisor's morning head count, he'd lose his job for sure. Everything about him seemed legitimate, from the calluses on his hands to the way he knew specific mine terminology, even showing me a laminated ID badge for a mining operation I recognized about 60 miles east. He just needed a ride to the next truck stop where his cousin could pick him up, and since company policy technically prohibited passengers, he offered to stay hidden in the sleeper bunk until we got there, promising to keep quiet and not cause any trouble. Against every instinct I'd developed over the years, I told him to climb in through the passenger door and get comfortable in the back while I finished my mandatory break time. For the first 3 hours, everything seemed normal, as I pushed through the darkness toward New Mexico, occasionally hearing him shift position in the bunk behind me or clear his throat quietly. The electronic logging device showed me right on schedule. The refrigeration unit hummed steadily at -10 degrees, and dispatch hadn't sent any urgent messages about route changes or security alerts. I kept the radio low, listening to overnight talk shows discuss everything from alien abductions to government conspiracies, the usual background noise that kept solo drivers from going stir-crazy during those endless stretches of asphalt. The passenger stayed true to his word, keeping silent except for a polite request to use the portable urinal I kept behind the seat, and I actually started to feel good about helping someone who genuinely needed it. Around 5:30, with the first hints of dawn starting to lighten the eastern horizon, I pulled into a way station that was closed for the weekend, figuring I'd catch a quick power nap before the final push into Albuquerque. I woke up to the sound of metal scraping against metal, a noise that instantly triggered every security alarm in my head because I knew exactly where it was coming from. My locked toolbox under the bunk. Through the curtain separating the cab from the sleeper, I could see movement, deliberate and methodical, not the fumbling of someone looking for aspirin or trying to find the light switch. When I yanked the curtain aside, the passenger was crouched on the floor with my own socket wrench in his hand, working on the bolts that secured a hidden compartment where I kept emergency cash and my backup GPS tracker. But what really made my chest tighten was seeing him calmly photographing the broken seal on my trailer's internal access panel, the one that connected the cab to the refrigerated cargo area, a seal that absolutely could not be broken without triggering a massive security investigation. He looked up at me with this expression of mild annoyance, like I'd interrupted him during a routine maintenance check, then pulled out my own phone from his pocket, swiping through photos I hadn't taken, my regular fuel stops, the apartment complex where I parked on home time, even shots of my daughter's dorm building from her move-in day last month. "Morning, friend," he said in a voice completely different from the worried mine worker I'd picked up, now carrying a professional tone like someone explaining a business proposal over lunch. He set my phone on the dashboard, keeping it just out of my reach, and explained that his associates had been tracking my route for 6 weeks, learning my patterns, my stops, even monitoring which rest areas I preferred for my mandatory breaks. The pharmaceutical load I was hauling contained a specific batch of cancer medications worth about $3 million on the black market, information that definitely wasn't public knowledge, which meant someone inside my company or the client's operation had provided intelligence. He showed me timestamps on the photos, some taken just days ago, others going back over a month, including one of me having coffee with my ex-wife at a diner in Amarillo, proving they'd been watching me long before tonight. The mining story, the authentic-looking badge, the calloused hands, all of it was theater, carefully rehearsed to exploit the exact kind of sympathy that would make a lonely middle-aged driver break protocol on a dark night. What he wanted was simple enough to understand, but impossible to accept. I was supposed to drive to a specific coordinate, about 40 miles off the interstate, where his team would unload exactly 7 pallets from the middle section of my trailer, the ones containing the targeted medications. After the transfer, I'd continue to a predetermined ravine, where I'd report my truck stolen, claiming I'd been ambushed at a rest stop while sleeping, and the company insurance would cover the loss while I walked away clean. He'd already manipulated my electronic logging device to show me taking a completely different route, sending false GPS pings to dispatch that placed me hundreds of miles from our actual location, creating a digital alibi that would make me look guilty if I tried to report what was really happening. The genius of their plan was its simplicity. If I cooperated, I'd be a victim, but if I refused or tried to alert anyone, the evidence would point to me as an inside accomplice who got cold feet, especially since I'd violated company policy by picking up a passenger in the first place. My CB radio, I realized when I glanced at it, had been opened up and rewired while I slept, the microphone cable neatly severed inside its casing, and my phone's battery, which had been fully charged when I went to sleep, now showed 2% despite being plugged into the charger he'd somehow disabled. He must have seen me eyeing the door handle because he casually mentioned that my keys were already with his partner, who was following us in a sedan about a quarter-mile back, close enough to intervene if I tried anything stupid but far enough to avoid suspicion. The way he explained it, like discussing a pizza delivery route, made the whole thing even more terrifying because this was just another day at work for him, another driver to manipulate, another load to steal, another life to potentially destroy if things went sideways. When I asked what would happen if I refused to drive, he pulled up a video on my phone showing the inside of my daughter's dorm room, taken from her own laptop camera while she slept, her stuffed elephant from childhood visible on the nightstand beside her. Not a threat exactly, just a demonstration of capability, proof that their reach extended far beyond this truck, beyond this highway, into spaces I thought were protected by distance and anonymity. He even knew her class schedule, mentioning that she had organic chemistry at 10 on Mondays, information that turned my stomach into a knot of pure dread because it meant they'd been watching her too, studying her routines just like they'd studied mine. I started the engine because what else could I do? My mind racing through scenarios that all ended badly while he settled into the passenger seat like we were old friends on a road trip. The coordinates he gave me led through a series of back roads I'd never traveled, past abandoned gas stations and collapsed barns that looked like they'd been rotting since the Reagan years, the kind of places where trucks weren't supposed to go, but where someone could easily disappear. He made me turn off the dash cam, physically removing the memory card and crushing it under his boot heel, then had me disable the trailer's refrigeration alarm so it wouldn't alert dispatch when the temperature rose from opening the doors. Every few minutes he'd check something on a tablet he produced from his bag, tracking our progress against some predetermined timeline, occasionally sending messages to people whose roles I could only imagine. The worst part was how normal he acted between giving instructions, asking about my years on the road, commenting on the sunrise, even offering me a stick of gum from a pack he'd found in my console, as if we weren't in the middle of committing a federal crime that would end my career and probably my freedom. When we reached the transfer point, an abandoned grain elevator surrounded by rusted silos and dead wheat fields, 3 men were already waiting with an unmarked box truck that looked like it hauled furniture or appliances. They worked with practiced efficiency, knowing exactly which pallets to take, using a portable forklift they'd brought to move the medications from my trailer to theirs in less than 20 minutes, never speaking to me or even acknowledging I existed beyond being the driver of the vehicle they were robbing. The passenger supervised the operation while maintaining his grip on my phone and keys, occasionally showing me the tablet screen where my truck still appeared to be traveling normally along I-40, according to the spoofed signals being sent to my company's tracking system. One of the men spray-painted over the serial numbers on the stolen pallets. Another took photos of the remaining cargo to ensure they'd left the right items behind. And the third carefully resealed the trailer doors with a device that somehow replicated the original seal's code, making it look like they'd never been opened. The whole operation felt like watching a pit crew at a NASCAR race, each person knowing their exact role, their precise movements, no wasted motion or unnecessary communication, just criminal efficiency perfected through repetition. After they left with the medications, the passenger directed me to continue driving deeper into nowhere, following dirt roads that my GPS didn't even recognize, until we reached a ravine where old appliances and stripped cars had been dumped over the decades. He explained that I'd leave the truck here, keys in the ignition, doors unlocked, making it look like I'd been carjacked by opportunistic thieves who dumped the rig after realizing they couldn't fence pharmaceutical cargo. His partner would drive me to a truck stop about 50 miles away, where I'd call the police and report the theft, sticking to a script he made me memorize about stopping to help what looked like a broken-down motorist and being overwhelmed by multiple attackers. The beauty of their plan was that the physical evidence would match my story. The truck would be found abandoned, the high-value cargo missing, the electronic logs showing me miles away from where the actual theft occurred, and my violation of company policy by picking up a hitchhiker would be buried under the larger crime. He even had a bruise kit in his bag, offering to give me some convincing injuries to support my story, though I declined that particular service, already feeling sick enough about what I'd been forced to participate in. But something shifted in my mind when he mentioned my daughter again, reminding me that cooperation was my only option if I wanted to keep her safe from any future complications. That's when I noticed the tablet he'd been using was still unlocked, sitting on the dashboard while he gathered his things from the sleeper compartment, the screen showing what looked like a messaging app with timestamps and locations. Without really thinking about consequences, I grabbed it and took photos with an old digital camera I kept in the door pocket for accident documentation, capturing screen after screen of their communication network, pickup coordinates, even partial names and phone numbers. My fingers working faster than my brain could process the stupidity of what I was doing. He caught me just as I was sliding the camera back into its spot, his expression shifting from mild surprise to something darker, but then he actually smiled and said it didn't matter because the tablet would be destroyed within the hour anyway. And who would believe a driver who'd already lied to police about a hijacking? The confidence in his voice suggested this wasn't bravado, but experience. That he'd dealt with desperate drivers before, ones who thought they could outsmart the system only to realize they were already too deep in the mud to crawl back out. The sedan that picked me up from the ravine was driven by a woman who never spoke, just drove while the passenger sat behind me, making sure I didn't try to memorize the route back or do anything clever with the door handles. At the truck stop, they left me with my dead phone, $20 for food, and a final reminder that my daughter's safety depended on me following through with the story. That their organization had a long memory and an even longer reach for people who complicated their operations. I waited exactly 30 minutes like they instructed, then used the payphone to call 911, my voice genuinely shaking as I reported the theft, the lie coming out easier than I expected because most of it was true. I had been forced at gunpoint to drive my truck somewhere. Men had stolen my cargo, and I'd been left stranded at a truck stop. The police believed me. The company investigators believed me. Even the FBI agents who eventually got involved believed me, especially after the truck was found exactly where I said it would be, stripped of its valuable cargo but otherwise intact. What I never told anyone was about the camera's memory card I'd hidden in my boot, those photos I'd managed to capture, evidence I kept for 3 months before finally mailing it anonymously to the DEA from a post office 2 states away, along with dates, routes, and every detail I could remember about the operation. 6 months later, I read about a major pharmaceutical theft ring being busted across 3 states, dozens of arrests including several trucking company employees who'd been feeding them information about high-value loads. The article mentioned recovered cancer medications worth millions, sophisticated GPS spoofing equipment, and a network that had been operating for years using the same method, recruiting desperate drivers through carefully orchestrated hitchhiker scenarios. I never found out if my anonymous tip contributed to the investigation, but I recognized one detail in the news coverage. They'd tracked the gang through digital communications on encrypted tablets, the exact kind of evidence I'd photographed during those terrified seconds in my cab. My daughter never knew how close danger had come to her life, still doesn't know why I insisted she transfer to a different college mid-semester, or why I paid for her to change apartments and get a new phone number. I quit long-haul driving after that night, took a local delivery job that pays half as much, but lets me sleep in my own bed, behind doors I can lock, in a house where I installed security cameras that I check obsessively, even though it's been over a year without any sign of trouble. The passenger's words still echo sometimes when I'm driving past rest stops on the interstate. That casual confidence when he said they'd done this before and would keep doing it until someone stopped them. I think about all the other drivers out there pulling lonely night shifts, checking their mirrors for following cars, wondering if that person standing by the entrance ramp really needs help, or if they're bait for something worse. The company never found out I'd broken policy by picking up a hitchhiker. The investigation focused entirely on the theft itself, and I kept my commercial license clean enough to keep working, though I'll never look at a load manifest the same way again. People ask me sometimes why I switched to day routes, why I gave up the better money, and I tell them I got tired of sleeping in the truck, which is true enough even if it's not the whole truth. The whole truth is that I learned the hard way how one moment of misplaced kindness, one decision to help a stranger on a dark highway, can turn you into a criminal, whether you meant to be one or not, and some mistakes follow you home no matter how many miles you put between yourself and that rest stop in Arizona. February of 2017 found me hauling refrigerated produce from Florida up to Boston. Same route I'd been running since my divorce papers got finalized, and I needed steady miles to keep my mind occupied. Most drivers my age were settling into local routes, but at 43, I preferred the long stretches where nobody asked questions, and dispatchers only cared if you made your delivery window. That particular Wednesday night, I'd already logged 11 hours, and was pushing through that dead zone on I-95 between Jacksonville and Savannah, where cell towers get scarce and the only company comes from static on the CB radio. My Freightliner had just crossed the 200,000-mile mark that morning, and I remember thinking how she still purred like a kitten when I kept her steady at 65, riding that sweet spot where the diesel engine hummed its lowest note. Around 2 in the morning, just past mile marker 42 where the highway cuts through nothing but pine forest and swamp, I caught sight of another rig's lights in my mirrors, maybe half a mile back, but gaining faster than they should have been. Now any trucker will tell you that nighttime on these empty stretches creates a kind of brotherhood. We watch out for each other, flash warnings about speed traps or debris, check on drivers who seem to be weaving from fatigue. But this rig behind me wasn't following any of the unwritten rules we all knew by heart. He'd speed up until his headlights filled my mirrors, then drop back suddenly, then surge forward again, like he was sizing me up or trying to read my trailer numbers in the dark. My CB had been quiet for the last hour, except for the occasional ghost signal from truckers too far away to understand. But then Channel 19 crackled to life with a voice that sounded like gravel mixed with cigarette smoke. "Slow your roll, friend, we gotta talk," the voice said. And right away I knew this wasn't any DOT inspection or friendly warning about a blown tire. Real truckers don't talk like that. Don't use that fake casual tone that tries too hard to sound harmless. I kept my speed steady and reached for my CB mic. But before I could respond, the rig behind me hit its hazards and started flashing its high beams in a pattern. 3 long, 3 short, 3 long again. That's when my gut started churning, because that wasn't any trucker signal I'd learned in 20 years of hauling freight. I watched him in my mirrors as he moved into the left lane and pulled alongside my trailer, matching my speed perfectly while his passenger window came down, and someone aimed a spotlight at my DOT numbers and the sealed door of my refrigerated unit. The voice came back on the radio, clearer now that he was right beside me. "Nice load you're carrying there, driver. 40,000 pounds of strawberries heading to Boston. Delivery tomorrow at 1600 hours to the Hunts Point warehouse." My knuckles went white on the steering wheel because that information wasn't something you could guess. Someone had either hacked into our dispatch system or had an inside source at my company. I glanced at my phone mounted on the dashboard, showing 1 bar of signal that kept flickering to none, and realized we were approaching the Ridgeland exit where there was a way station that had been closed for renovations for the past 3 months. Just a dark pullout with no cameras and no witnesses. The rig beside me started edging closer, not enough to hit me, but enough to make his intentions clear. We were going to have that talk whether I wanted to or not. I tried to accelerate past him, but another set of headlights appeared in front of me. A second rig that had been running dark until now, slowing down to trap me in the right lane. They had me boxed in like wolves cornering prey, and when I grabbed my CB to call for help on Channel 9, the emergency frequency, all I got was dead static like someone was running a jammer. The lead truck ahead started pumping his brakes, forcing me to slow from 65 to 40, then 30, as we approached that abandoned way station. My fuel gauge showed a quarter tank, enough to make Boston if I didn't stop, but not enough to outrun these guys if this turned into a chase. The voice on the radio came back, and this time I could hear other voices in his cab, at least 2 more people, all of them laughing at something that hadn't been said yet. "Here's the thing, friend," he continued, and I could tell he was enjoying this, drawing it out like a cat playing with its food. "Your company owes our mutual broker 60 grand for that Miami deal that went sideways last month. The one where your dispatcher claimed the load got refused but somehow still got delivered and paid out to the wrong account. Now we could handle this through lawyers and insurance companies. Could make a real mess of things. Get DOT involved. Maybe have them crawl through every logbook violation and overweight ticket your company ever collected. Or we could settle this tonight, just between professionals, and everybody goes home happy." I'd never heard of any Miami deal. Had been running the Boston route exclusively for 6 months, but the way he said it made me realize this wasn't about truth or lies. This was about 3 trucks against 1 on a dark highway where anything could happen and be explained away as driver error or equipment failure. The truck in front of me suddenly hit his brakes hard, and I had no choice but to follow him into the way station pullout, my wheels crunching over broken asphalt and glass from who knows how many years of neglect. As soon as I stopped, the rig behind me pulled in diagonal across the exit, blocking any chance of escape, while the one that had been beside me positioned itself along my driver's side, so close I couldn't open my door without hitting his fuel tank. Before I could even set my parking brake, I heard boots hitting pavement and saw a figure climbing up onto my trailer using the rear door handles, a thick-shouldered man wearing coveralls with no company logo and a baseball cap pulled low over his face. He had something in his hand that looked like a modified tire pressure gauge connected to a small metal cylinder, and he was heading straight for my glad hand connections, where the air lines from my cab connect to the trailer brakes. "You're making this harder than it needs to be," the voice on the CB said, while I watched the man on my trailer kneel down near the connections. "All we want is 1 pallet from your load. Just 1 single pallet of those premium berries. Call it a finder's fee for helping you remember that debt. Your manifest shows 42 pallets, you roll into Boston with 41. Tell them 1 got damaged, some boxes crushed. Had to dump it for safety. Insurance covers the loss, your company takes a small hit, nobody gets hurt, and we all pretend this never happened." Through my passenger mirror, I could see 2 more people had gotten out of the rear truck, both carrying what looked like crowbars or tire irons, standing casual but ready, like they'd done this before and knew exactly how it would play out. The man on my trailer did something with his device, and I heard a sharp hiss of air, then felt my trailer brakes engage slightly, just enough to know that whatever he'd done, I wouldn't be driving away without his permission. I reached for my phone to try calling 911, but the screen showed no service, not even emergency calls, and when I tried to take a photo of the trucks around me, the camera app kept crashing like the phone itself was fighting against me. That's when the real fear set in. Not the adrenaline rush of a dangerous situation, but that cold, deep dread when you realize how thoroughly you've been trapped. The CB crackled again, and this time it was a different voice, younger, with a slight southern drawl. "Your ELD just showed a critical fault, driver. Says you've been running off duty for the last 6 hours when you were actually driving. That's a federal violation right there. Could lose your CDL for that kind of falsification." I looked at my electronic logbook display, and sure enough, it was showing error codes I'd never seen before. My carefully logged hours replaced with gibberish that would make me look guilty of exactly what they were claiming. "Now here's where we're at," the first voice returned, sounding almost bored now that they knew they had me. "You can sit there and be stubborn, and we'll call this in to state police. Report an erratic driver who's been falsifying logs, probably on stimulants, aggressive, refused to stop when concerned fellow drivers tried to check on him. By the time cops get here, if they even come to this dead zone, they'll find your logs all messed up. Maybe find some contraband that wasn't there before, if you know what I mean. Or you can open that trailer, let us take what we're owed, and drive away clean, maybe a little lighter but still with your career intact." The man who'd been working on my trailer jumped down and walked to my passenger door, tapping on the window with that modified gauge device, grinning like we were old friends sharing a joke. Behind him, one of the others was already setting up what looked like a portable loading ramp, the kind you'd use to roll pallets off a trailer without a dock, and I realized they'd come prepared for this exact scenario, had probably done it dozens of times before to drivers just like me. Something inside me shifted then. Maybe it was pride, or maybe just the simple math that giving in now meant they'd own me forever, knowing I'd helped them steal once and could be squeezed again and again. I grabbed my CB mic and switched to channel 17, a frequency some old-timers still monitored, and started talking fast and clear. "Break 17. This is Unit 449 southbound at the closed Ridgeland scale. 3 trucks running a cargo theft setup, blocking me in, tampering with my equipment. Need immediate assistance. Any driver copy?" For a second there was nothing but static. Then suddenly multiple voices came through, truckers who'd been listening in the dark, and I heard someone say they were northbound 5 miles out and coming hard. The voice on channel 19 turned ugly quick. "You just made the biggest mistake of your life, driver. You're gonna regret that." But I'd already started recording everything on my personal dashcam that they didn't know about, the one I'd hidden behind my sun visor after a friend got burned in an insurance scam. I kept talking on channel 17, describing the trucks, reading out partial plate numbers when their lights hit them right, and within minutes I could see headlights in the distance. Lots of them. A convoy of drivers who'd heard the call and decided enough was enough. The thieves saw them too, and suddenly their careful plan fell apart as they scrambled back to their rigs, the man with the device yanking something from my airlines that made a loud pop and sent air hissing everywhere. They peeled out of that rest stop so fast they left their loading ramp behind, and as the other truckers pulled in around me, creating a protective circle with their rigs, I sat there shaking, not from fear anymore, but from anger at how close I'd come to losing everything I'd worked for. One of the drivers who'd responded, an older woman driving for night transportation, helped me check my airlines and found the jamming device still partially attached, a piece of evidence that would later help state police track down similar attacks across 3 states. The police report I filed that night ran 12 pages long, and the detective who interviewed me said I was lucky. 2 other drivers hadn't been so fortunate that month, one run completely off the road near Fayetteville when he tried to resist, another found at a truck stop beaten so badly he couldn't identify his attackers. My damaged airlines cost $800 to properly repair, and my company had to send another driver to team with me to Boston Since my ELD data was so corrupted, it took their IT department 3 days to restore it. But what still haunts me, what makes me check my mirrors constantly even now, 6 years later, is knowing how perfectly they'd planned it all. The dead zone location, the ELD tampering, the broker story that sounded just plausible enough, the way they knew exactly which buttons to push to make a driver choose between his cargo and his career. I still run that same stretch of I-95, still past that abandoned way station, now finally demolished and turned into just another patch of forest, but I never run it alone anymore. I joined a group of drivers who coordinate their routes through that corridor, making sure nobody's isolated in those dead zones where cell towers don't reach and help is just a wish. We've got our own channel now, Channel 38, and we check in every 20 miles. A rolling safety net of drivers who learned the hard way that the real danger on these highways isn't falling asleep at the wheel or blown tires or bad weather. It's the predators who know exactly how vulnerable we are out here, alone in our cabs with hundreds of thousands of dollars of cargo and nothing but a thin sheet of aluminum between us and whoever decides we're worth the risk. The FBI eventually arrested 7 people connected to that ring, though the voice on the radio that night, the one who seemed to be running the show, was never identified. Sometimes on quiet nights when I'm running through that stretch, I still hear whispers on Channel 19, voices that sound almost familiar, asking innocent questions about what drivers are hauling and where they're headed. And I wonder how many more crews are out there, waiting in the dark for the next driver who's running alone, tired, and far from help. "12 years hauling freight across the western states teaches you which jobs to take and which ones to leave alone. But sometimes the money talks louder than your instincts. Most drivers my age were either settling into local routes or had moved up to owning their own rigs. But here I was at 37, still taking whatever paid best, still sleeping in truck stop parking lots and showering at Flying J locations from Nevada to California. My ex-wife used to say I was married to the road more than I ever was to her, and maybe she had a point, but those long stretches of empty highway paid for our daughter's college tuition. So I kept my complaints to myself and my eyes on the white lines disappearing under my headlights. When dispatch called me about a construction debris contract paying triple the usual rate, I should have asked more questions, but rent was coming up, and my transmission had been making expensive sounds lately. The job seemed straightforward enough. Pick up loads from a demolition site about 60 miles outside of Reno, haul them to a specialized disposal facility near the California border, mostly night runs to avoid the heat and traffic. The company, Silverstone Disposal Solutions, had all their paperwork in order, proper permits, insurance verification, everything checked out when I ran it through the carrier's system. They even offered a bonus for drivers who could handle multiple runs per week, cash paid daily, which wasn't standard but wasn't unheard of either in this business. My first pickup was scheduled for a Monday night at 11, and the directions took me way off the interstate, down a series of progressively narrower roads until I was navigating by GPS alone through terrain that looked like it hadn't seen development since the mining boom ended. The site itself was an old casino complex, one of those places that tried to capitalize on being halfway between Reno and nowhere, probably went belly up when the recession hit and never recovered. Chain link fencing surrounded the property, portable floodlights running off generators, and a crew of maybe 8 guys working with excavators and dump trucks, breaking down what was left of the main building. The foreman, a guy named Vince with arms like telephone poles and a scar that ran from his left ear to his jaw, barely looked at my paperwork before pointing me to where they were loading. They had me back up to a pile of broken concrete, rebar, drywall chunks, the usual demolition mix, and started loading my trailer with an excavator that had seen better days. The operator knew his business, though, distributed the weight properly, didn't overload, and in 20 minutes I was tarped up and ready to roll. Vince handed me an envelope with $500 in cash, said it was for fuel and expenses, told me there'd be another $500 waiting at the disposal site. The whole thing felt more like a drug deal than a legitimate hauling contract, but I'd worked with contractors who operated in cash before, guys who kept their money away from ex-wives or the IRS. So I tucked the envelope in my jacket and headed out into the desert night. The disposal facility was another 2 hours west, and about halfway there, I had to pull over for a mandatory inspection at a way station that I knew would be closed, but still required a logged stop for compliance. Part of the routine was checking the load, making sure the tarps were secure. Nothing had shifted during transport. I climbed up on the passenger side, flashlight between my teeth, and started checking the bungee cords when I noticed one corner of the tarp had worked loose, probably from the wind resistance at highway speeds. As I reached over to resecure it, my flashlight beam caught something white among the chunks of concrete and drywall, something that made me pause and lean in closer. At first, I thought it was PVC pipe or maybe some kind of insulation, but the texture was wrong, too smooth, too organic looking. I pulled the tarp back further, used my hand to brush away some of the smaller debris, and that's when I saw the teeth. 3 molars still attached to a piece of jawbone, mixed in with the rubble like they belonged there. My first thought was that maybe it was from an animal, deserts full of dead livestock and wild horses, but I'd seen enough deer skulls and cow bones growing up in ranch country to know the difference. These were human teeth, human bone, and as I stood there on the side of my trailer in the middle of the Nevada desert, I realized that the crushing sounds I'd heard while they were loading might not have all been concrete breaking apart. The smart thing would have been to cover it back up, deliver the load, take my money and forget I ever saw anything, but I kept thinking about news stories I'd seen, missing persons cases, families waiting for answers. I took pictures with my phone, close-ups of the bones, wider shots showing them mixed in with the debris, then carefully covered everything back up and secured the tarp. My plan was to finish the delivery, act normal, then figure out who to contact once I was somewhere safe with better cell service. The disposal facility was exactly where they said it would be, a massive pit operation with industrial grinders and sorting equipment, the kind of place that could make anything disappear into landfill material within hours. The night supervisor, a nervous-looking guy who kept checking his phone, handed me another envelope without saying much, just pointed where to dump the load. I watched the excavator grab huge chunks of my cargo, including the section where I'd found the bones, and feed it all into a grinding machine that turned everything into gravel-sized pieces. The drive back to Reno gave me too much time to think, and by dawn, I'd made my decision to call the state police from a truck stop near Carson City. The detective I spoke to, a woman named Diane Reeves, took my report seriously enough to meet me within an hour, looked at my photos, took copies of all my paperwork. She told me to continue with my scheduled runs, act like nothing had changed while they investigated quietly. What she didn't tell me, what I found out later from another driver at a rest stop, was that I wasn't the first one to report finding human remains and construction debris from sites connected to Silverstone disposal. 2 other drivers had come forward in the past year, but both had mysteriously decided to recant their statements after receiving better-paying job offers from affiliated companies, jobs that took them far away from Nevada. Detective Reeves had me wear a wire for my next pickup, said they needed more evidence before they could move on Silverstone, wanted me to get Vince or someone else talking about what they were really hauling. The weight of that recording device taped to my chest made every breath feel like a confession, and when I pulled up to the demolition site that next night, Vince took one look at me and I knew he could tell something was different. He walked around my truck twice, slow and deliberate, ran his hand along the undercarriage like he was checking for tracking devices, then leaned in close enough that I could smell the cigarettes and coffee on his breath. He asked if I'd had any trouble with the last load, if anyone had given me problems at the disposal site, and when I said no, he smiled in a way that made my skin prickle with sweat despite the cool desert air. That night they loaded my trailer with unusual care, Vince personally supervising every scoop, and when they were done he climbed up to check the tarp himself, his boots leaving muddy prints on my running boards. He found my phone in the cab where I'd left it charging, turned it over in his hands like he was memorizing the model, then set it back down exactly where it had been. Before I left, he handed me the cash envelope but held onto it when I tried to take it. Made me look him in the eye while he told me that Silverstone valued loyalty, that drivers who kept their routes running smooth could make more money than they'd ever dreamed of, but drivers who complicated things had a tendency to find other work real quick. The whole time he was talking, one of his crew members was taking pictures of my license plate, my dot numbers, making sure they had everything they needed to find me again if they had to. I made that delivery with my knuckles white on the steering wheel, dumped the load without looking at what might be mixed in with the concrete this time, and drove straight back to Detective Reeves at the state police station. The recording hadn't picked up anything useful, just ambient noise and Vince's carefully chosen words that could mean anything to anyone listening. Reeves said they'd need me to do one more run, maybe two, that they were close to getting a warrant, but needed something more concrete. And I laughed at her choice of words, even though nothing about this was funny. She promised they'd have undercover units watching me, that I'd be safe, but we both knew that was the kind of lie cops tell witnesses to keep them cooperating. I told her I'd think about it, needed to sleep on it, but the truth was, I'd already decided to take one more load from whatever long-distance company would have me, and never set foot in Nevada again. That night I parked at a Love's truck stop just outside Sparks, figured I'd be safer surrounded by other drivers than alone somewhere, and tried to get some sleep in my cab. Around 3 in the morning, something woke me up, a subtle shift in the weight of my truck, like someone had climbed onto the back. I lay still, listening, heard footsteps on the metal deck of my trailer, moving slowly from the rear toward the cab. Through my side mirror, I could see a shadow, human-shaped but moving wrong, checking each tie-down strap, each tarp corner, methodical and patient like they had all night to do whatever they'd come to do. Then the footsteps stopped right outside my sleeper, and I heard fingers running along the rivets of my door, testing the lock, and a voice I recognized but couldn't quite place whispered my name, my actual name, not my handle or my company number, and told me that Silverstone had a message for me about keeping my scheduled runs. I didn't wait to hear the rest of the message, just fired up the engine and pulled out of that parking spot so fast I nearly clipped the fuel island, saw in my mirrors the shadow figure stumbling backward off my running board. Other drivers were already stirring, lights coming on in nearby cabs, and I knew whoever had come for me wouldn't try anything with that many witnesses around. I drove straight through the rest of the night, called Detective Reeves from the road and told her everything, said I was done being bait, that she had 12 hours before I was crossing into Oregon and never coming back. She tried to convince me to stay, said they were hours away from making arrests, but then I heard something in the background of her call, Vince's voice talking to someone in her office, asking about paperwork for a witness who'd been in an unfortunate trucking accident, and I knew right then that Silverstone's reach went deeper than anyone had imagined. The FBI raids happened 6 days later, made national news for about a week before getting buried under political scandals and celebrity divorces. But by then, I was already running produce from Washington to Montana, sleeping in different truck stops every night, never staying in one place long enough for anyone to track my patterns. They arrested 17 people, including Vince, found evidence linking Silverstone to disposal of bodies from organized crime hits across 3 states, victims who'd been mixed into construction debris and scattered across legitimate landfills where they'd never be found or identified. Detective Reeves sent me one message saying they couldn't have done it without my photos and initial report, but I knew better than to respond. Knew that even with Vince locked up, there were others out there who remembered my face, my truck, my name. Some nights I still wake up thinking I hear footsteps on my trailer, still check my mirrors for vehicles that follow too long, still wonder about every load of construction debris I see on the highway, and what secrets might be buried beneath those blue tarps, ground down into dust and scattered to the desert wind. My CDL still sits in my wallet, expired now for 2 years. Right behind the credit cards I maxed out paying for lawyers after everything went sideways with that government contract job. I keep meaning to throw the license away, but something always stops me. Maybe because getting rid of it would mean accepting that my trucking days are really over, that what happened on Highway 54 outside Liberal, Kansas, changed everything permanently. Secured Transit Solutions hired me for what seemed like a straightforward flatbed haul in early November. Just another specialized equipment run from their facility near Topeka to a research center in Colorado Springs. I'd been driving flatbed for over a decade by then, mostly independent contracts after leaving my job with a major carrier when I turned 33, and government subcontractor work paid well enough to keep my Peterbilt running and the mortgage current on my place outside Wichita. Carla from STS called me directly, said she got my number from another driver who'd done classified hauls before, and asked if I could be at their loading facility within 48 hours for a priority shipment. The money she quoted made me sit up straight at my kitchen table, triple my usual rate with a cash advance that would hit my account before I even hooked up the trailer. She emailed over the contracts, pages and pages of confidentiality agreements and liability waivers, all standard-looking legal language except for one section that specified I couldn't discuss the cargo with anyone, including law enforcement, unless presented with a federal warrant. The loading appointment was set for 6 in the morning on a Monday, and when I arrived at their facility, a converted warehouse complex surrounded by fresh razor wire and cameras every 20 feet, 2 guards in unmarked uniforms checked my ID 3 times before waving me through the gate. Inside the loading bay, they already had the cargo on a specialized flatbed trailer, everything covered with military-grade tarps that had been heat-sealed at the edges and secured with numbered cable locks that I wasn't allowed to touch. The load itself was strange. 3 identical rectangular shapes about 8 feet long and 4 feet wide, positioned perfectly parallel to each other with custom steel brackets holding them in place. I walked around the trailer doing my standard pre-trip inspection, while a guy in a black polo shirt followed me with a clipboard, writing down every move I made, even noting when I checked the tire pressure. When I tried to peek under one corner of the tarp to verify the load was properly secured, he grabbed my wrist hard enough to leave marks and reminded me about the confidentiality agreement I'd signed. They handed me a sealed envelope with routing instructions that I wasn't supposed to open until I left the facility, along with a cheap prepaid phone that I was told to keep on at all times. Carla appeared one more time before I left, walking up to my cab window with another set of papers for me to sign, these ones acknowledging that I understood the federal penalties for discussing classified materials. She leaned in close enough that I could smell her coffee breath and told me that this load was time-sensitive, that people were counting on me to deliver it exactly as instructed, no stops except at the 3 designated fuel stations marked on my route. The way she said it made the hair on my arm stand up, like there was some kind of threat hidden in her words. But the deposit had already cleared in my account, and backing out would mean returning money I'd already mentally allocated to overdue bills. I opened the envelope once I hit Highway 50, pulling over at a way station to read through the instructions, while my hands trembled slightly from too much coffee and not enough sleep. The route they'd mapped out made no sense, taking me south through Liberal instead of the direct path west on 70, adding at least 4 hours to what should have been a simple 8-hour drive. Each fuel stop had specific instructions: park in the northwest corner of the lot, leave the engine running, go inside for exactly 15 minutes, buy something, use the restroom, return to the truck without speaking to other drivers. The prepaid phone rang as I was reading, a robotic voice asking for my exact GPS coordinates, then hanging up before I could ask any questions. Everything went smooth for the first 3 hours, just me and the steady hum of the diesel engine, watching the Kansas farmland roll by in the pale morning light. Made my first scheduled stop at a Shell station near Pratt, followed the instructions to the letter, bought a sandwich I didn't want, and used a bathroom I didn't need while watching the clock on my phone. Nobody approached the truck while I was inside, but when I came back out, there was a white sedan parked 3 spaces away with tinted windows and government plates, engine running, nobody visible inside. The same car followed me back onto the highway, staying exactly 5 car lengths behind for the next 30 miles, before taking an exit that led to nothing but wheat fields. The second stop was supposed to be at a Conoco near Meade, but when I got there around noon, the place was crawling with state troopers. 4 cruisers parked at different angles around the pumps like they were waiting for something. I circled the lot once, my gut telling me to keep driving, but the prepaid phone started ringing non-stop until I finally pulled in and parked where I'd been instructed. None of the troopers even looked my way, which somehow made it worse, like they were deliberately avoiding eye contact. Inside the store, the clerk, a kid maybe 19 with bad acne scars, kept glancing at the door while he rang up my energy drink, and when he handed me my change, he whispered something that sounded like, "They're watching," before turning away to stock cigarettes. By the time I reached Highway 54 heading toward Liberal, the weather had turned nasty, dark clouds rolling in from the west, with that greenish tinge that makes any Midwest driver nervous about tornadoes. The prepaid phone had been silent since the Conoco stop, which worried me more than the constant check-ins. About 15 miles outside Liberal, just past a sign for some abandoned grain elevator, I saw them in my mirrors, 2 black Suburbans coming up fast, no plates visible, windows dark as oil. They boxed me in smooth as anything, one in front and one behind, and the lead vehicle hid its hidden blue lights, the kind mounted behind the grille that you'd never notice until they were flashing right in your face. I pulled over on the shoulder, gravel crunching under the tires, my heart hammering so hard I could feel it in my throat. 4 men got out, all wearing identical black tactical pants and navy windbreakers with no agency markings, just little radio earpieces and holstered sidearms. The one who approached my window had a shaved head and a neck tattoo that looked military, some kind of unit insignia I didn't recognize. He didn't show a badge, didn't introduce himself, just told me to step out of the vehicle and keep my hands visible. When I asked what this was about, he grabbed my arm and yanked me down from the cab, nearly dislocating my shoulder in the process. They made me stand facing my truck while they cut the cable seals on the tarps, the sound of the bolt cutters echoing across the empty fields. One of them climbed up on the trailer with some kind of handheld scanner, running it over each of the 3 shapes, while another guy typed on a military-grade laptop balanced on the hood of their Suburban. The scanner started clicking like a Geiger counter, faster and faster as he moved it toward the middle container, and suddenly all 4 of them backed away from the trailer like it was about to explode. The guy with the neck tattoo got on his radio, speaking in some kind of code I couldn't follow, lots of numbers and letters that meant nothing to me, but his voice had gone from aggressive to genuinely scared. Within 10 minutes, the whole area turned into a circus, helicopters appearing from nowhere, more black vehicles streaming down the highway, guys in hazmat suits setting up some kind of perimeter around my truck. They put me in the back of one of the Suburbans, no handcuffs, but the door handles didn't work from the inside, and I sat there for 3 hours watching them work through the tinted windows. Nobody would answer my questions. Nobody would tell me what was in those containers. Just kept asking me the same things over and over. Who hired me? What route was I supposed to take? Did I stop anywhere that wasn't on the manifest? The guy with the neck tattoo finally came back, tossed my CDL and phone on the seat next to me, and told me I was free to go, but the truck and trailer were being impounded for national security reasons. They drove me to a motel in Garden City, paid for a week in advance, and told me not to leave town until someone contacted me. The next morning, Secured Transit Solutions' phone number was disconnected, their website gone, like they'd never existed at all. I tried calling Carla's direct line, but it just rang and rang with no voicemail. 3 weeks later, I saw it on the news while eating breakfast at a diner. An industrial explosion at a chemical plant in Nebraska. 4 dead, investigators finding traces of materials that matched the serial numbers from my impounded trailer. The FBI showed up at my door that same afternoon with a warrant, seized my laptop and all my paperwork, started asking about my connections to domestic terrorist groups, whether I knew what I was really hauling, why I deviated from the planned route when I hadn't deviated at all. My lawyer, a former JAG officer I found through a veterans group, managed to get the charges dropped after 8 months of pure hell, but by then the damage was done. Word had gotten around the trucking community that I was under federal investigation. Insurance companies wouldn't touch me, and nobody wanted to hire a driver who might bring that kind of heat to their operation. The lawyer dug up some interesting stuff, though. Secured transit solutions had been incorporated just 2 days before they contacted me, dissolved the day after my cargo got intercepted, and the address they'd given me led to an empty lot that had been vacant for years according to county records. The facility where I'd picked up the load had security footage, but somehow all the cameras had malfunctioned that morning, every single one, and the guard company had no record of ever providing personnel to that location. I still get calls sometimes, always from blocked numbers, asking if I remember anything else about that day, if I've talked to anyone about what happened, reminding me that my NDAs are still legally binding even though the company no longer exists. My wife thinks I should just forget about it, move on with our lives, maybe go back to school and learn a trade that doesn't involve driving. But late at night when I can't sleep, I keep thinking about those 3 containers and whatever was making that scanner go crazy, wondering if I was hauling something that ended up killing those people in Nebraska, or if maybe those men in the Suburbans saved a lot more lives by stopping me when they did. Either way, I know I'll never get answers, just like I know there's probably someone watching my house right now, making sure I keep my mouth shut about the whole thing, which is exactly what I've done until now. Posting this from a library computer 2 states away, because I figure people deserve to know that sometimes your own government will use you, frame you, and throw you away without a second thought. Anyone who's driven a rig for a living knows the industry runs on 2 things: fuel and trust. When both start running low, you make decisions you wouldn't normally make. That's where I was in March of 2023, 41 years old with a small fleet of 3 trucks that were bleeding me dry on repairs. My best driver had just quit to work for one of the mega carriers, and I was staring down a month where I'd have to choose between making the insurance payment or keeping the trucks running. That's when I got the email from a broker I'd never heard of before, Westline Logistics, offering rates that were 30% higher than what I was used to seeing. The loads were overnight runs, always starting after 8 in the evening, always ending before dawn. The email said they specialized in time-sensitive freight for clients who valued discretion. I should have known better, but desperation has a way of making red flags look like opportunities. The first job seemed straightforward enough. Pick up a sealed container at a warehouse outside Louisville, drive it to a distribution center near Indianapolis, drop it off, collect payment. The paperwork looked legitimate, proper BOL, all the right stamps and signatures. Even had dot numbers that checked out when I looked them up online. The weird part was the pickup itself. The warehouse was in an industrial zone that looked half abandoned, just one building with lights on in a sea of dark structures. A guy in a Westline Logistics jacket met me at the loading dock, wouldn't make eye contact, just handed me the keys to the container and told me the code for the lock. He made me sign a separate non-disclosure agreement right there on a clipboard, said it was standard procedure for sensitive cargo. I asked what was in the container, and he gave me this rehearsed line about proprietary manufacturing equipment. The whole interaction took maybe 5 minutes. I hooked up the container, checked the seals were intact like the paperwork specified, and headed out. The drive was quiet, just me and the highway and the nagging feeling that I should have asked more questions. The payment hit my account before I even made it back home, which never happens in this business. Usually you're waiting weeks for brokers to process payments, chasing down invoices, dealing with short pays and deductions. But Westline paid in full, plus a bonus for what they called professional discretion. That money kept my operation alive for another month. So when they emailed again a week later with another overnight run, same rate plus an extra $200 for fuel, I didn't hesitate. Then it became a pattern. Every week, sometimes twice a week, always overnight runs, always sealed containers, always different pickup and drop-off locations across the Midwest. The paperwork was always perfect, the payments always immediate. I started recognizing some of the warehouse locations, noticed they were always in these isolated industrial areas, where nobody would pay attention to truck traffic at odd hours. The loading dock workers were different each time, but they all had that same nervous energy, that same refusal to make conversation. One time I tried to make small talk with a guy who looked about 20, asked him how long he'd been working for Westline, and he just stared at me like I'd asked him to confess to a crime. He mumbled something about being a contractor and practically ran back inside. About 2 months in, I started noticing other trucks at these locations. Not the same trucks, but they all had something in common. They were owner-operators like me. Smaller outfits, guys running 1 or 2 rigs. I'd see them at the pickup points, waiting in the staging areas, and we'd do that trucker nod. That acknowledgement that we were all part of the same world. But nobody talked. There was this unspoken understanding that you didn't ask questions about Westline jobs. The money was too good, and we all needed it too badly. One night at a warehouse outside Dayton, I saw a Peterbilt that looked familiar. A custom paint job in deep blue with silver flames that I swear I'd seen at a truck stop months earlier. The driver was gone though, just the truck sitting there in the lot with its lights off. I remember thinking it was strange that someone would leave a rig that nice unattended, but I was already running late for my own pickup. I didn't think about it again until much later, when I should have been paying attention to all the small details that were adding up to something very wrong. The job that changed everything came on a Wednesday in early May. Westline sent me coordinates instead of an address, which was a first, along with instructions to arrive at exactly 11:30 at night, not earlier, not later. The location was way out in rural Pennsylvania, nearly 3 hours from where I'd made my last delivery. The route took me off the interstate onto progressively smaller roads until I was on a 2-lane county highway, with nothing but farmland and woods on either side. My GPS kept trying to reroute me back to main roads, like it didn't believe this destination could be real. When I finally found the turnoff, it was just a gravel road with no sign, no mailbox, nothing to indicate what was back there. I checked the coordinates 3 times before I committed to turning in. The road went on for maybe half a mile through dense trees, and then suddenly opened up into this massive clearing with a chain-link fence, topped with razor wire running the entire perimeter. There were sodium lights mounted on tall poles, bathing everything in that harsh orange glow that makes everything look like a crime scene. The gate was closed, and there were 2 men standing in front of it wearing security uniforms and carrying what I'm pretty sure were rifles, not just handguns. I stopped about 50 feet from the gate, engine idling, trying to figure out what kind of legitimate business operation needed this level of security in the middle of nowhere. One of the guards walked up to my window, shined a flashlight directly in my face, and asked for my name and confirmation number without any greeting or explanation. I gave him the information, and he walked back to a small guardhouse I hadn't noticed before, made a phone call, then came back and told me to proceed to loading Dock 7. The gate rolled open with this grinding mechanical sound that seemed way too loud in the quiet night. As I drove through, I got my first real look at what was inside the fence, and that's when my chest started feeling tight. There were trucks everywhere. Not just a few, but dozens of them, lined up in neat rows like some kind of vehicle graveyard. Big rigs, day cabs, sleepers, all different makes and models, all just sitting there dark and empty. I recognized the blue Peterbilt immediately, parked in the 3rd row with 6 other trucks that looked just as well maintained and expensive. None of them looked abandoned or junked. They looked like they'd been driven there yesterday and parked carefully. The loading docks were along one side of the property, attached to a long metal building with no windows and no company name anywhere visible. I backed into Dock 7 like I'd been instructed, but my mind was racing through every possible explanation for what I was seeing. Maybe it was a fleet storage facility. Maybe these were trucks being held for auction or repair. But that didn't explain the armed guards or the razor wire, or the complete absence of any identifying information. A man in a different uniform, not security but something like a supervisor, came out and knocked on my door. He had a tablet in his hand and that same avoidance of eye contact I'd seen from every other Westline worker. He told me to leave the engine running, exit the vehicle, and come inside to complete the paperwork. Something in his tone wasn't a request, it was an instruction, the kind you don't argue with. I climbed down from the cab, and he walked me through a metal door into a hallway that smelled like oil and something chemical I couldn't identify. The walls were bare concrete block, the floors were stained, and there were more cameras than I'd ever seen in any warehouse, mounted in every corner. Every doorway, all of them with little red lights indicating they were recording. He led me into a small office where another man was sitting behind a desk, older, maybe in his 50s, wearing a polo shirt with a Westline Logistics logo embroidered on it. The man behind the desk smiled at me, but it didn't reach his eyes. He gestured to a chair and said we needed to go over some additional documentation for this particular load. He slid a stack of papers across the desk, and I started reading through them, but the language was dense and confusing, full of legal terminology about asset transfers and equipment reassignment and liability waivers. I asked what this was about, why this job required different paperwork than the others, and he leaned back in his chair and said something that made every instinct in my body scream. He said that given the nature of the operation and the sensitive cargo I'd been transporting, they needed to ensure complete operational security going forward. I asked what he meant by going forward, and he just kept smiling that flat smile. Then he said that my truck would need to remain on the property for a standard safety inspection and equipment verification process that would take approximately 72 hours. I stood up and said that wasn't part of the agreement, that I had other deliveries scheduled, that I needed my truck. He didn't stand up, didn't raise his voice, just calmly said that the inspection was non-negotiable and outlined in the contract I'd signed 2 months ago. I pulled out my phone to call someone, anyone, and realized I had no signal. Not one bar. He noticed me checking and mentioned that the property had cellular interference due to the security systems. That's when I knew I wasn't leaving. I tried to keep my voice steady and asked if I could at least get my personal belongings from the cab. He nodded and said one of the security personnel would escort me. We walked back out to the loading dock, and the guard who came with me wasn't the friendly escort type. He stood close enough that I could smell his cologne, watching my every move as I grabbed my duffel bag, my logbook, and my wallet from inside the sleeper. That's when I noticed something that sent a jolt of pure panic through me. The VIN plate on my dashboard, the one that's riveted in place and never supposed to be removed, had a small scratch mark around the rivets, like someone had been measuring or photographing it. I looked at the guard and he was already staring at me, waiting for me to finish up. I grabbed what I could and let him walk me back inside, this time to a different part of the building. He opened a door to what looked like a break room, except there were 4 other guys in there, all of them with that same exhausted, trapped expression. One of them was wearing a Schneider Company shirt. Another had a Cat Diesel power cap, all of them owner-operators by the look of it. The guard told me to wait there, that someone would bring me dinner and that I'd be called when my inspection was complete. Then he locked the door from the outside. The second the lock clicked, one of the men, heavyset guy with a gray beard and wearing a worn denim jacket, looked at me and said, "How many runs did you do for them before they brought you here?" I told him maybe 15, 20 loads over 2 months. He shook his head and said he'd done 37 before they'd finally pulled him in. Another guy, younger with a southern accent and grease stains on his jeans, said he'd been in this room for 5 days. 5 days. I asked what they were doing with the trucks, and the man with the beard said exactly what I'd been afraid to think. They were stealing them, not through force but through paperwork. Every load we'd hauled had been legitimate enough to establish a pattern of trust. Meanwhile, they were collecting our information, our routes, our registration details, everything they needed to create false ownership documents. Once they had your truck on this property, they'd re-VIN it, forge new titles, and sell it off to chop shops or overseas buyers. As for the drivers, we'd signed NDAs and contracts so dense with legal language that we'd basically agreed to keep our mouths shut or face massive lawsuits. But more than that, they had documentation showing we'd willingly driven loads for them dozens of times, which meant if anyone went to the police, we'd look just as complicit. The younger guy said 2 drivers had already signed over their trucks rather than risk prosecution. They'd been given $5,000 cash and dropped off at a bus station with a story about selling their equipment to pay debts. Nobody would question it. Nobody would investigate, and the trucks would disappear into the black market like they'd never existed. I sat there for hours trying to figure out a way out that didn't end with me losing everything or worse. The man with the beard, his name was Glenn, said they'd already offered him the buyout that morning, and he was planning to take it because he couldn't afford a legal battle, and his truck had a lien on it anyway. But my situation was different. I owned my 3 trucks outright, no loans, and one of them was sitting in this compound about to be stolen. If I signed it over, I'd lose not just that truck, but my entire business. I'd have nothing left. Around 3 in the morning, a different guard brought in sandwiches and bottles of water, and I noticed he propped the door open while he set the food down, just for a few seconds. Didn't even bother to check if we were all accounted for. That's when I realized something important. They weren't treating us like kidnapping victims because legally we weren't. We'd driven here voluntarily, we'd signed paperwork, and we were being fed and housed. If anyone asked, they'd say we were in a contractual dispute over equipment. They were sloppy because they didn't think we'd run. But I also noticed something else. The guard's radio was clipped to his belt and it was set to an open channel. I could hear dispatch chatter, and more importantly, I heard one of the guards say he was heading to the north gate to let a transport truck out. When the guard left and locked us back in, I told the others what I'd heard, and that I thought the north side of the property might be less monitored if they were focused on moving trucks out. Glenn said there was no point, that the fence was too high and the guards had weapons. But the younger guy, his name was Joey, said he'd noticed ventilation grates in the bathroom that connected to some kind of ductwork. It was a long shot, but we were all desperate in different ways. Around 4 in the morning, when we heard vehicle sounds and voices outside indicating another truck was being moved, Joey and I went into the bathroom and pried open the vent cover with a belt buckle. The duct was narrow, but not impossible. It took us maybe 20 minutes of crawling through sheet metal and insulation before we came out in what looked like a storage area on the opposite side of the building. From there, we found a loading door that wasn't fully secured, just held by a chain with enough gap to squeeze through. We ran across the lot, staying between the parked trucks for cover, and when we reached the fence line, we used one of the trucks as a ladder to climb up and carefully get past the razor wire, using our jackets as protection. I cut my arm pretty badly, and Joey twisted his ankle landing on the other side, but we were out. We ran through the woods until we hit that county highway, and then kept walking until we found a house with lights on about 2 miles down the road. The people who lived there were an elderly couple who let us use their phone to call the state police. What happened next took months to fully unfold, but the short version is that the police raided the property within hours of our call and found exactly what we described. 43 trucks, all reported stolen or missing over the past 8 months, all with altered VINs and forged documentation. They arrested 12 people on site, including the man in the polo shirt who turned out to be running the entire operation under multiple shell companies. Westline Logistics didn't exist as a legitimate business. It was just a website and a forwarding address. The FBI got involved because the operation crossed state lines and involved identity theft on a massive scale. They'd been using our driver's licenses and DOT numbers to create fake profiles, then using those profiles to secure loans and lines of credit before disappearing. Glenn and the other 2 drivers who were still in that room when the raid happened were released immediately. My truck was recovered, though it took 6 weeks of legal paperwork to get it back, and I had to replace the entire VN plate assembly because they'd already started the alteration process. I lost 2 months of income dealing with depositions and insurance claims, and I'm still paying off the legal fees. Joey got his rig back too, though his had already been partially stripped for parts. The thing that still keeps me up some nights is thinking about how many drivers might have just taken the buyout and walked away, never reporting it, never knowing they were part of something this big. I see posts sometimes on trucking forums, guys complaining about shady brokers or missing equipment, and I always wonder if they crossed paths with the same operation or one like it. I run my own loads now, no brokers, no overnight mystery runs, even if it means lower pay. Trust isn't something I give out easily anymore, and every time I see a truck sitting abandoned at a warehouse or a too-good-to-be-true load offer, I remember that fence and those rows of stolen rigs and how close I came to being just another driver who vanished. Driving refrigerated pharmaceuticals doesn't sound dangerous until you're the one responsible for keeping insulin stable at precisely 38 degrees while crossing a mountain pass in a blizzard. My commercial license renewal came through that January of 2015, which meant I'd turned 26 somewhere between the Utah border and that nightmare convoy through Teton Pass. I'd been hauling for Bridger Medical Transport for nearly 3 years by then, mostly solo routes, because the premium pay helped chip away at my mom's mounting medical bills from her botched knee replacement. The teaching credential I'd abandoned 2 years earlier felt like someone else's life entirely, especially on nights when I'd pull into a truck stop at 3 in the morning with my muscles aching and my thermos empty. But the job was mine, earned through countless hours of practice backing into tight loading docks and memorizing weight distribution charts that other drivers couldn't be bothered to learn. The convoy assignment came through dispatch on a Monday afternoon while I was finishing a delivery in Salt Lake. 6 refrigerated trucks needed to push medical supplies north to Billings before a massive winter system locked down the mountain routes for potentially a week. Bridger only organized convoys during severe weather advisories, when the risk of a solo driver getting stranded with a frozen load outweighed the inefficiency of coordinated travel. A veteran driver named Howard Pembroke got tapped as road captain, someone whose gravelly voice I'd heard countless times on the CB coordinating movements and warning about speed traps. When we staged at the truck stop in Logan that afternoon, Howard walked the line of rigs doing his safety check, a stocky man in his late 50s with wire-rimmed glasses that kept fogging up in the December cold. He stopped at my door, squinted up at my cab, and told me I'd be running sweep position at the rear of the convoy. His reasoning sounded solid enough at the time. My rig had the newest LED visibility array, and he wanted someone reliable watching for stragglers or mechanical failures. We rolled out just before sunset, which in December meant we'd be climbing into darkness by the time we hit the Sirius elevation. The convoy stretched ahead of me like a string of red taillights, each rig maintaining the mandatory 50-yard gap that Howard had drilled into us during the briefing. My CB crackled with periodic check-ins as we climbed, drivers calling out their positions and confirming their reefer units were holding temperature. The road was already getting bad, that kind of packed snow that turns to ice under your tires and makes every slight turn feel like a negotiation with physics. I kept my speed steady, my hands loose on the wheel the way my instructor had taught me during training, and tried not to think about the 16 pallets of insulin and antibiotics riding behind me. The pharmaceutical loads were always the worst for stress because you knew that somewhere down the line, actual human beings were counting on that shipment arriving intact and on schedule. About 40 minutes into the climb, one of the trucks near the front started having issues. I could hear it on the CB before I could see anything. A driver named Carl, reporting that his reefer unit was showing temperature fluctuations. Howard's voice came back immediately, calm and methodical, telling Carl to maintain speed and keep monitoring while he figured out if we needed to stop for a mechanical check. That's when I noticed the truck directly in front of me, a navy blue Freightliner with mud flaps that read Summit Freight, starting to tap its brakes more than necessary. Not the gentle pressure you'd use on a downhill grade, but these weird, irregular jabs that made the brake lights flare bright and then dim in a pattern that didn't match the road conditions. I clicked my CB to call it out, but before I could speak, Howard's voice filled the channel again, this time directing all drivers to tighten up the gaps because visibility was dropping fast with the snow coming down harder. The Summit Freight truck hit its brakes hard about 10 minutes later, not a tap this time but a full stop that had me downshifting fast to avoid rear-ending him. My rig shuddered as I brought it down, the weight of the load pushing against my deceleration, and I watched the Freightliner's driver's side mirror as it swung wide and pulled off onto a narrow turnout carved into the rock face. The turnout wasn't marked as an official rest area, just a widened shoulder that maintenance crews probably used for equipment storage. Before I could process what was happening, The driver leaned out his window and waved me forward with these big, exaggerated arm movements like I was supposed to follow him in there. My gut told me to keep rolling, to click the CB and ask Howard what the protocol was for a truck-breaking convoy formation, but the Freightliner was completely blocking my lane now, and the shoulder was the only place with enough room to get around him safely. I pulled in, my headlights sweeping across the turnout and illuminating something that made my chest tighten. 2 more trucks were already parked there, tucked back against the rock wall in positions that suggested they'd been waiting rather than stopping for an emergency. Both were running, exhaust pluming white in the cold air, and as my rig came to a complete stop, a 3rd truck pulled in behind me, effectively boxing me into a space barely large enough for 4 rigs. The drivers emerged almost simultaneously, 3 men in heavy Carhartt jackets and insulated gloves, their faces ruddy from the cold, but their expressions hard and focused in a way that had nothing to do with weather concerns. The one from the Freightliner, a tall guy with a graying goatee, approached my driver's side while the other 2 flanked my passenger side and rear. I rolled my window down maybe 3 inches, enough to hear him but not enough to make myself vulnerable, and he immediately launched into an accusation that caught me completely off guard. He said I'd cut into his lane about 20 miles back, that I'd forced him to brake hard and nearly sent him into the guardrail. And that kind of reckless driving in convoy formation was exactly the type of thing that got people killed on mountain passes. I genuinely had no memory of cutting anyone off, and I told him so through the narrow gap in my window, keeping my voice level, even though my heart was hammering against my ribs. He didn't seem interested in my explanation. Instead, he pulled out a small notepad, the kind drivers use to log fuel stops, and said that given the severity of the incident and the risk I'd posed to the entire convoy, he needed to see my key cargo certificate and manifest. His tone had shifted into something official sounding, like he was conducting a legitimate safety inspection. And when I hesitated, one of the other drivers, a shorter guy with a red face and a thick neck, moved closer to my passenger door and rapped his knuckles against the window. The sound was loud enough to make me jump. The tall one kept talking, saying that Summit Freight had contracted with Bridger before, and they knew the protocol for reporting unsafe drivers, that if I cooperated now they could handle this between professionals without involving the highway patrol or my company's safety department. He wanted me to open the trailer for a visual inspection of my load, just to confirm I was maintaining proper temperature and hadn't compromised the shipment with my erratic driving. Everything about the request was wrong. Drivers don't inspect each other's loads on the side of the road, especially not in the middle of a blizzard on a mountain pass. Cargo certificates stay with the driver and only get shown to authorized personnel at weigh stations or delivery points. But I was alone, surrounded by 3 rigs and 4 men who clearly had coordinated this stop, and the wind was picking up in a way that made the temperature inside my cab drop every time it whistled through the window gap. I reached for my CB handset, intending to call Howard and report the situation, and that's when the tall driver did something that made the whole scene crystallize into focus. He reached up to his own shoulder mic, clicked it on, and broadcast over the convoy channel in this smooth, reasonable voice that there was a safety check in progress at mile marker 73, minor traffic incident being documented, and all other drivers should maintain course and speed to Billings. Then he added, almost as an afterthought, that Howard should continue leading the main group and not wait up because weather conditions were deteriorating fast. Howard's voice came back within seconds, acknowledging the message and confirming that the convoy would proceed as planned. The reality of my situation hit me like a physical weight. These men had access to the convoy frequency, knew the protocols well enough to mimic legitimate safety procedures, and had just successfully isolated me from any help using the very chain of command that was supposed to protect us. I sat there with the handset still in my grip, watching the tall driver's face through my partially open window, and saw the shift in his expression from pseudo-professional to something colder and more calculating. He told me they'd heard about a Bridger rig that had gone missing earlier that week, somewhere between Idaho and Wyoming, a full load of high-value pharmaceuticals that never made it to its destination, and was currently listed as stolen in every law enforcement database from here to the Canadian border. His company, he said, had a client expecting a delivery that couldn't happen now because of that theft, and my manifest showed I was carrying exactly the kind of product mix that could substitute for what they'd lost. The math was simple. I could hand over my cargo certificate, open my trailer, and let them offload half my pallets to cover their shortage, or I could refuse and deal with the consequences of a formal safety violation report that would go directly to Bridger's compliance office. The threat wasn't even subtle. The red-faced driver moved around to my driver's side, standing close enough that I could see the water vapor from his breath fogging against my mirror. He laid out exactly what would happen if I didn't cooperate. They'd file a detailed incident report claiming I'd engaged in aggressive driving, failed to maintain proper following distance, and refused to allow a safety inspection of my refrigeration unit. They had dashboard camera footage, he said, or at least they'd claim to have it, and with 3 drivers willing to provide matching statements against my word alone, Bridger would have no choice but to suspend my license pending investigation. Even if I eventually got cleared, which could take months, I'd lose my current route assignments, my safety bonus, and any chance of getting premium pharmaceutical runs in the future. The tall one pulled out his phone, showed me a screen with what looked like a formal complaint form already partially filled out with my truck number and license plate, and said all it would take was 1 click to submit it through the industry safety reporting system. They knew I couldn't afford that kind of hit to my record, not with my mom's medical bills piling up and my entire income dependent on maintaining a clean driving history. My satellite phone was dead, battery drained from the cold after I'd forgotten to bring it inside during my last rest stop. The CB was useless now that they'd already established their narrative with Howard, and even if I could reach him, what was I supposed to say that wouldn't sound like excuses from a driver who'd legitimately screwed up? The wind was howling through the gap in my window, and I could feel the temperature in my cab dropping degree by degree, while these men stood outside in their insulated gear, perfectly comfortable waiting for me to brake. I looked past them at the wall of rock on one side and the steep drop on the other, both barely visible through the thickening snow. The third driver, who hadn't spoken yet, walked back to his truck and returned with a set of bolt cutters, not threatening me with them directly, but just holding them casually while he leaned against my trailer door. The message was clear. I could open it voluntarily, or they'd open it themselves and add destruction of property to their fictional incident report. My hands were shaking now. Not from fear exactly, but from this sick combination of rage and helplessness that comes from knowing you're being robbed in slow motion, and there's not a single person coming to help you. But then something shifted in my head, a moment of clarity that cut through the panic. These men were drivers, which meant they were on a schedule just like me, and this mountain pass was going to be completely impassable within the next few hours, based on the weather reports I'd checked before leaving Logan. They needed this done fast, which meant they were banking on me being too scared or too exhausted to call their bluff. I rolled my window down another inch, just enough to make eye contact with the tall one, and told him in the steadiest voice I could manage that I needed to see his operating authority number and his company's safety rating documentation before I'd even consider opening my trailer. It was a completely reasonable request under actual DOT regulations, the kind of thing any driver should be able to produce instantly if they're legitimately affiliated with a registered carrier. His face changed immediately, that professional mask slipping just enough for me to see the calculation happening behind his eyes. He started to respond, probably with another threat, but I cut him off and said I was also going to need the incident timestamped and location verified through the convoy's GPS coordination system, which Bridger monitored in real time for all pharmaceutical loads. That part was partially a bluff since I wasn't entirely sure how closely dispatch actually watched our GPS pings during active runs, but it was enough to plant doubt. The 3 men exchanged glances, and I watched the dynamic shift in real time. The red-faced one stepped back from my passenger door, his aggressive posture deflating slightly. The tall driver with the goatee tried to maintain control, launching into another explanation about how they were all registered carriers with Summit Freight, and this was standard procedure for convoy incidents. but his voice had lost that authoritative edge. I interrupted him again, louder this time, and said that if this was legitimate, then he wouldn't have any problem with me documenting everything on my dashboard camera and uploading it to Bridger's incident server before we proceeded. I didn't actually have a functioning dashboard camera. The mount had broken 2 months earlier, and I'd been too broke to replace it. But he had no way of knowing that. I reached for my sun visor like I was adjusting a camera angle and watched his face go through this rapid series of calculations. The wind hammered against my rig hard enough to rock it slightly, and I could see fresh snow accumulating on their shoulders and hoods at a rate that meant the pass was going to be undrivable within the hour. They were running out of time and they knew it. The tall one made one final attempt, his voice hardening as he said I was making a serious mistake by being uncooperative, that I clearly didn't understand how the industry worked or what happened to drivers who got reputations as troublemakers. But even as he said it, he was already backing toward his Freightliner, and the other two were moving toward their own rigs. The whole confrontation had lasted maybe 15 minutes, though it had felt like hours, and now they were retreating because the risk calculation had shifted against them. If I actually had cameras, if dispatch actually was monitoring my GPS closely, if I actually followed through on documenting their operating authority and filing my own report, then they'd be the ones facing scrutiny instead of me. The third driver with the bolt cutters tossed them into his cab and slammed the door without looking back. Within 2 minutes, all 3 trucks had fired up their engines, maneuvered out of the turnout in a chaos of reversing and repositioning that nearly put one of them into the ditch, and disappeared up the mountain road ahead of me. I sat there alone in the turnout with my engine idling, and my whole body shaking from adrenaline dump, watching their taillights fade into the white curtain of snow until there was nothing left but the howling wind and the knowledge that I'd just barely avoided something that could have destroyed everything I'd worked for. I waited another 5 minutes to make sure they were really gone, then pulled back onto the highway and drove the rest of the pass at maybe 20 miles per hour. My hands welded to the steering wheel, and my mind replaying every moment of that encounter on an endless loop. I never saw those trucks again, never heard their voices on the CB, and when I finally rolled into the Billings distribution center 8 hours later, exhausted and wired and still half convinced they might be waiting for me somewhere, my load was intact, and my manifest was clean, and nobody at Bridger ever knew how close they'd come to losing an entire shipment to a coordinated theft disguised as a safety check. When you spend most nights alone on the interstate, you start to see things differently. I'd been hauling refrigerated freight for almost a year back then, running long stretches through the Midwest. My routine was simple: music low, thermos of coffee within reach, and a habit of counting mile markers to stay awake. That night the sky was heavy with clouds, no moon at all, and the air felt damp like it might rain. I was between loads, heading toward an industrial park to pick up medical supplies scheduled for early morning delivery. Everything about the drive felt ordinary until I saw the figure standing on the shoulder, waving both arms. At first I thought it was a trick of the headlights, but the shape didn't move away. I slowed and saw a young woman in jeans and a gray hoodie, hair sticking to her face from the wind. She looked terrified, eyes darting toward the trees like she expected someone to come out of them. I pulled onto the gravel, keeping the rig's hazards flashing, and she ran up to the door before I could even roll the window down. "Please, my car died," she said, voice cracking. She was shaking so badly she could barely hold her phone. Against better judgment, I unlocked the passenger side and let her in to warm up. She smelled faintly of diesel and some sharp chemical scent I couldn't place. While I dialed for roadside assistance, she kept thanking me, saying most drivers just sped past. Her name, she said, was Tara. She worked part-time at a lab in the city and had been driving back after a late shift when her car broke down. I believed her. She looked exhausted, pale under the dash light. We made small talk about night driving, gas prices, the weather, but every few seconds she glanced toward the console where my dispatch papers sat. I didn't think much of it until she quietly slipped one folded sheet into her jacket pocket. I caught the motion in the corner of my eye. "Hey, what are you doing?" I asked. She froze for a split second, then laughed it off, saying she thought the paper was hers. I didn't push it, I just wanted to drop her at the next safe spot. A few miles later, I pulled into a way station that was closed for the night. Lights on, nobody there. The moment I stopped, she changed. Her polite tone vanished. "I can't get out," she said flatly. "Not yet." Then she reached into her bag and took out 2 small vials wrapped in gauze. "I need to deliver these. It's urgent. 2 exits ahead." At first I thought she was joking. I told her there was no way I was driving anywhere without knowing what was inside those vials. She pressed her thumb against one of the labels, and I saw the print blur. It wasn't even sealed properly. "They're medical samples," she said, eyes locked on mine. "Just fluids, nothing dangerous, I swear." I told her I'd call a tow truck for her car, and maybe she could explain everything to the cops when they showed up. That's when her whole demeanor shifted. She unzipped her hoodie and pulled out her phone, flipping the screen toward me. It showed a map of my route, my carrier name, and my home address in bold letters. She must have noticed how I looked at the screen because she smiled. Not the friendly kind. "You're not really in a position to say no," she said softly. "You're marked as the driver on this load. If I make one call, your log shows tampering, maybe even cargo interference." My throat tightened. I asked her how she got that information, and she told me there were people who monitored sympathetic drivers, those who picked up strangers, offered rides, or helped stranded motorists. "You're exactly who we look for," she said. "Decent, predictable." The words made me feel smaller with each syllable. She started explaining things I didn't want to know. How courier rings moved unregistered biomedical material between private labs. How sometimes they lost couriers, so they used helpers, regular drivers, unaware at first, then pressured later. She said those who refused were blacklisted. "It's easy," she went on. "All they have to do is file a report. 1 ELD discrepancy, 1 missing scan, and your company dumps you." She said it like she'd done it before. I remember gripping the wheel so tightly my knuckles ached, trying to keep my breathing steady. I told her to get out. She didn't even blink. Instead, she leaned back and crossed her arms like she owned the cab. The only sound was the hum of the refrigeration unit outside. My hazard lights blinked red across her face every few seconds, like a metronome counting down. I tried reasoning, told her she could walk, that I wouldn't tell anyone. She said she'd already sent messages to her people, sharing my truck number and location. "You can't disappear," she added quietly. "You drive on public roads. You leave a trail every day." For the first time in my life, I wished the way station wasn't so empty. I sat there for what felt like forever, headlights sweeping past from the highway now and then, each one briefly lighting her face. I knew if I panicked, I'd lose control of the situation completely. So I did the only thing I could think of. I played along. I told her fine, I'd take her 2 exits down. I turned the rig back on, pretending to adjust the GPS, but I was actually opening the camera app on my phone, trying to record without her noticing. She kept checking her messages, whispering under her breath like someone was giving her directions. I merged back onto the highway, my pulse so loud it drowned out the engine. When we reached the next exit, she pointed toward a narrow frontage road that cut behind a cluster of old warehouses. The lights ahead were dim and yellow, flickering like they hadn't been replaced in years. "There," she said, and I could see a black SUV idling by a dumpster, no plates visible. I slowed down but didn't stop completely. Instead, I told her the brakes were acting up and that I needed to roll forward a bit before I parked. As soon as she looked toward the windshield, I hit the air horn, long and loud. The SUV's headlights flashed, and whoever was inside backed away fast, startled. In that instant, she yelled at me to stop, but I threw the truck into gear and kept going. She screamed something about ruining everything, but I barely heard her. A few miles down, I pulled into a brightly lit rest stop where a couple of other drivers were parked. She tried to open the door, but the handle jammed, child lock still on. I shouted for one of the guys outside to call the police. When she realized people were watching, she stopped shouting and went eerily calm, tucking the vials back into her jacket like nothing had happened. By the time the state trooper arrived, she'd changed her story again, said I'd offered to smuggle things for her and then turned on her. But I had the video, even if it was shaky and half dark. They took her away after checking her ID. Apparently it didn't match any real record. The trooper told me to keep my doors locked and file a report with my company immediately. For weeks after, I expected someone to call, or for those people to show up at a fuel stop somewhere, but nothing ever came of it. The company said there was no record of any complaint, no sign anyone had tried to access my ELD logs. Still, I changed routes and never stopped for anyone again. Sometimes late at night when I pass an empty shoulder, I think about that first glimpse of her under the headlights. I used to think helping strangers made the road a little less lonely. Now, I just keep driving. I've been driving long-haul routes for nearly 15 years, mostly through the Midwest. Back then, I had a habit of stopping at the same small rest area off I-70. Nothing big, just 2 gas pumps, a diner with 5 booths, and a vending machine that always ate my quarters. The kind of place you remember because it breaks up the monotony of endless miles. I'd been there maybe a dozen times over the years, enough for the waitress to start recognizing me. Her name was Lila, I think, red hair tied up with a pencil, and that habit of humming old country tunes while refilling coffee. That week started like any other. I left St. Clair County before dawn, planning to make it to Denver by nightfall. Around mid-morning, I reached the exit where the rest stop always sat. The big blue sign that used to say, "Fuel, Food, Restrooms" was gone. At first, I thought maybe construction crews were redoing the entrance, but when I pulled in, the asphalt was cracked and overgrown. The gas station canopy still stood, but the pumps were missing entirely, just metal stubs jutting from concrete like broken teeth. I parked the truck, got out, and stood there for a minute trying to piece it together. The diner windows were boarded up from the inside. The menu sign faded into a ghost of its old self. No tire marks, no trash, no evidence anyone had been there in months. Even the air felt still, like the whole place had been vacuum sealed. I walked around back, half expecting to find a closed for renovation notice, but there wasn't a trace. Just silence and wind whistling through an empty ice freezer. Confused, I decided to stop at the next town a few miles down the highway. I pulled into a small diner off Main Street, grabbed a coffee, and asked the lady behind the counter what happened to the rest area down the road. She looked at me like I'd asked about a dream. Said she'd lived there her whole life and never heard of any rest stop near that exit. When I tried explaining where it used to be, she laughed softly and said maybe I was mixing it up with somewhere else. But I knew that stretch of road like the back of my hand. I couldn't shake the weirdness. After finishing my coffee, I went back to the truck and pulled up my GPS history. Sure enough, it showed multiple stops at those same coordinates over the years. I even remembered refueling there last time, just a few months earlier. I had a receipt from the gas pump tucked in my logbook. When I checked, it was still there. The station's name, a timestamp, even the same exit number. But when I tried looking up the company online, there wasn't a single record of it. No listing, no business registration, nothing on Google Maps, just a blank spot surrounded by farmland. That night, parked at a truck stop outside Hayes, I started scrolling through old dashcam footage. It took a while, but I found a clip from a previous trip, clear as day, pulling into that exact rest area. You could see the diner's red neon sign flickering, a guy in coveralls fueling up his pickup, and that same blue logo on the gas canopy. But when I paused the frame and zoomed in, something about the background bothered me. There weren't any highway signs visible, no mile markers, no exit numbers, just darkness beyond the lot, like the whole thing existed in its own pocket of space. The next morning, I called the state highway department, hoping maybe it had been shut down for safety reasons. The operator checked their database and said there were only 2 official rest areas along that section of I-70, and neither matched the one I described. She even emailed me a map to prove it. I mentioned the receipt, but she said counterfeit branding isn't unheard of, and that I should contact the state police if I thought something shady was involved. That word, counterfeit, stuck with me the rest of the drive. So later that afternoon, I stopped by a patrol office off the interstate. The officer on duty, Sergeant Hill, listened to my story without interrupting. When I showed him the receipt and dashcam clip, he leaned closer to the screen, his expression tightening. He asked me to forward the footage to a specific email, then told me quietly that I wasn't the first driver to bring up a disappearing rest area. Apparently, others had reported similar locations. Fake truck stops popping up overnight, built by organized groups trying to skim electronic logs and cargo manifests from long-haul rigs. Sergeant Hill explained that the setup was sophisticated. These groups would scout quiet stretches of interstate, rent or buy old lots, and reconstruct fake rest stops with stolen signage and used equipment. They even installed dummy fuel pumps wired to hidden devices that read ELD ports when drivers connected for receipts or Wi-Fi. It looked legitimate enough. Logos, uniforms, receipts, everything. Then, when they had enough data, they'd target certain trucks carrying high-value cargo. By the time police got wind of it, the entire operation would vanish overnight, dismantled piece by piece before dawn. When I asked how they could pull it off without anyone noticing, he said they used stolen construction permits and unregistered trucks, working mostly after midnight. Locals thought it was state maintenance or contractors putting up a new facility. By the time daylight came, it looked like a normal, open rest stop. Then one night they'd load everything back up and disappear, leaving only concrete and weeds. Hill said they'd raided a few similar sites before, but most were wiped clean before evidence teams arrived. Driving home later that week, I passed that same exit again. I slowed down, staring at the empty lot, and for a second, I swore I saw faint tire tracks leading into the grass. Not fresh, but not completely gone either. The diner's outline was still visible under the dust, like a ghost shadow of where it once stood. I didn't stop. I just kept rolling west, the silence in the cab louder than the hum of the engine. I couldn't stop thinking about how many other places like that might still be out there, waiting for another driver to pull in. I've kept that receipt ever since, tucked in my glove compartment. The logo's faded now, the ink bleeding from heat and time, but it's proof, at least to me, that the place existed. Or maybe it didn't. Maybe I was one of the last people to ever see it before it disappeared for good. Either way, I don't stop anywhere that isn't on an official highway list anymore. You learn to trust your instincts on the road, but after that day I also learned to trust the map more than my memory. Name's Aaron Mitchell, and for the last few years I've run a refrigerated rig hauling boxed beef and poultry into grocery chain distribution docks. Life on the road turned into a routine I could manage. Pre-trip at dawn, coffee that tastes like cardboard, and the white noise of the reefer humming behind me like a generator in a distant room. Bills got paid, mileage stacked up, and I kept my head down. That particular morning began like any other. Clean BOL, seal number noted. Temperatures steady at set point. The air carried that cold, metallic smell when you crack the trailer doors a sliver to check frost on the chute. Nothing exotic about the route, nothing unusual about dispatch. Still, a thought kept pinging the back of my mind. The last 2 drops had shown weights a little lighter than what I'd scanned. Not a huge gap, just enough to raise an eyebrow. The seal on today's load looked fine at first glance, same color, same serial format. But the crimp had a tiny burr, like someone closed it with a tool that didn't belong to it. My notes from prior runs showed a different style of crimp entirely. Inside the trailer, the air felt too crisp for the temp reading on the unit. The probe said one number, my breath said another. The data line on the ELD recorded a short stop the night before, at a location I didn't recognize, just a code where a city tag usually lives. Dispatch brushed it off as a ping glitch when I called, telling me to make my window and quit worrying. I kept rolling toward the first dock, repeating the seal number out loud, trying to anchor it in my head. Little things matter with a reefer: weights, temps, seals. And today, the little things didn't quite line up. At the distribution yard, I backed into a door next to another reefer rig I'd seen on this route a handful of times. The driver climbed down. Caleb Foster, mid-30s, ball cap with a frayed brim, the kind of guy who keeps his gloves clipped to his belt so he never loses them. We traded quick hellos while the dock light went red. He mentioned his paperwork showed a shrink on the last run that didn't match what he'd scanned. I joked about ghost pallets, and he didn't laugh. When his turn came to open up, he pointed at his seal. Same color as mine, same serial style, same odd burr on the crimp. We compared BOLs right there on the bumper, and a chill ran through me that had nothing to do with the trailer. His recorded gross and my recorded gross were mirror images, like someone swapped items between two nearly identical loads. We pulled our ELD temp graphs and laid the phones side by side on the dock plate. Both showed a tiny temperature ripple around the same time overnight. Less than a degree, barely a hiccup, but visible if you knew how to read the slope. His log, like mine, had that mysterious stop code with no location tag, sandwiched between miles that should have been continuous. The receiving clerk called out that my door was going green, but I held back. If we swung the doors and something didn't match, it would be on us. We asked for a supervisor and requested a witnessed break of the seal with a scale ticket at the dock. The clerk frowned, made a call, and came back with a new tone in his voice. "You two wait here." The dock light stayed stubbornly red, and the hum of the building felt suddenly louder, like we'd stepped into a machine that just noticed us. After nearly 20 minutes, a man in a reflective vest appeared, clipboard in hand, with a tight expression like someone who'd just stepped into a problem he didn't want. He asked for our paperwork, then told us both to stay put while he made a few calls. Through the window, I watched him talk to a warehouse manager and another guy in a collared shirt with no badge, just a visitor pass clipped sideways. They kept glancing at our trucks like we were part of something bigger than a missing pallet. The other drivers unloading around us looked uneasy. One muttered that corporate had been running new suppliers lately. Nobody seemed to know where those suppliers were based. When they finally broke the seals under witness, the trailer smelled wrong. Not spoiled exactly, just metallic and sharp, the way a slaughterhouse alley does on a humid day. The boxes near the back looked fine, but halfway in, markings started to change. Some cartons had inked stamps that didn't match USDA print specs. One even had the font misaligned. Caleb's load showed the same irregularities. We filmed what we could before being told to stop. The warehouse manager's voice turned clipped, asking if we'd tampered with anything. He mentioned the possibility of contamination reports. I could tell the tone had shifted from concern to accusation. We were told to park and wait for further instructions. No one said who would be giving them. By late afternoon, a couple of unmarked sedans pulled up, and two men in suits started photographing both rigs, including license plates. One of them asked if I'd signed for my seals personally, as if I'd forged them myself. Caleb tried to reason with them, explaining how dispatch assigned the loads sealed and documented. They barely acknowledged him. Within an hour, we were escorted off the dock, told the loads were being held pending inspection. My company called soon after, flat tone, corporate speak, saying all deliveries for that supplier were temporarily suspended. 2 days later, the story broke on a regional news site. "Drivers accused in meat tampering scandal," the headline said, with our truck numbers blurred just enough to avoid legal risk, but clear enough for anyone who knew us to recognize. The article claimed an investigation uncovered uninspected product distributed through unauthorized channels, tied to unlicensed slaughterhouses posing as USDA-certified facilities. The kicker was that the logistics company, our employer, collapsed almost overnight. Website offline, dispatch phones disconnected, payroll frozen. The whole thing vanished like it had never existed. Caleb texted me that night. "We were just delivery hands. How do we end up the villains?" The following week, state inspectors reached out for statements. They wanted to know when I'd first noticed irregularities, who had loaded the trailers, and whether I'd seen any third-party tags. I told them everything: the mismatched seals, the off readings, the duplicate stops on the logs. They listened, nodded, and promised follow-up. But the official report that came out later barely mentioned the drivers. It framed the entire thing as logistical oversight, implying we'd missed standard checks. No mention of counterfeit suppliers, no acknowledgement that the dispatch system had been rerouting data to fake coordinates. They needed scapegoats to make the story neat for the evening news, and two haulers fit the role perfectly. Caleb tried to find a lawyer, but every firm he contacted dropped him once they realized how messy the case was. I filed unemployment and waited for someone to tell me what came next. Weeks passed in silence. Every time I heard a reefer unit start up on a passing truck, it felt like a reminder of how quickly something ordinary can turn into evidence. One afternoon, a man in plain clothes came by my apartment with a card that had no department name, just a phone number. He set off the record that investigators had traced the missing product to warehouse shells leased under fake business names. The people behind it had scrubbed their trail so clean that even the leasing agents didn't know who paid them. Months later, I started hauling again for a smaller outfit, sticking mostly to regional runs. I still check every seal twice, compare serials to the log, and avoid night pickups whenever possible. Sometimes I think about how easy it was for an entire operation to exist in plain sight, using drivers like me as camouflage. Those counterfeit seals were the perfect disguise, small, ordinary details that no one questions until the numbers stop adding up. I kept one of them, the one from that last run, sealed in a plastic bag inside my glove box. A reminder that trust on the road isn't guaranteed, not even from the company whose name is painted on your trailer. I've told this story a few times, mostly to rookies at truck stops who think the scariest part of the job is fatigue or bad weather. They laugh until they realize how quiet the industry gets when something like this happens. The truth is, the most dangerous thing out here isn't what's on the road. It's what hides behind paperwork that looks official. I used to think I understood the business I worked in. Now, every manifest feels like a mystery waiting to unfold, one barcode at a time. Hello, everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. Now, let's begin. Snow has a sound when it falls at night, a kind of soft whisper that most people probably find peaceful. When you sleep under a bridge or tucked behind a dumpster, that whisper sounds more like a countdown. Every flake that lands on your sleeping bag is another tiny weight pressing down, another degree stolen from your body, another minute closer to the moment when you might not wake up. I turned 34 the same week the first real storm hit Omaha last January. Someone at the soup kitchen handed me a stale cupcake with a crooked candle, and I sat there staring at it for a long time before I could eat it. Not because I was ungrateful, but because birthdays on the street feel like mock celebrations, like throwing a party on a sinking ship. Another year survived, sure, but at what cost and for how much longer? Pete Garrison understood that feeling better than anyone I knew out there. We had met 2 winters prior at a warming center near the old railroad depot, both shivering so violently that our teeth chattered in unison like some broken percussion instrument. Pete was maybe 55 years old, with a gray beard stained yellow around his mouth from decades of cigarettes, and these watery blue eyes that always seemed to be searching for something he had lost and would never find again. He told me once that he had worked as a plumber for 23 years, owned a little house with a paid-off mortgage, had a wife named Ruth who made the best chicken pot pie in all of Nebraska. Then Ruth got pancreatic cancer, and 6 months later, Pete was sitting in an empty house that suddenly felt like a tomb. The grief ate him alive. He stopped showing up to work, stopped paying bills, stopped caring whether he lived or died. By the time he found himself on the streets, he said it almost felt like relief. like he had finally stopped pretending that life without Ruth was worth fighting for. That January had been brutal from the start, but the weather forecast for that particular Wednesday made even the veterans nervous. The temperature was supposed to drop to -15, with wind chills pushing it closer to -30. I remember standing outside the library on Monday afternoon, watching people rush past in their puffy jackets and heated car seats, and thinking about how fragile the line is between their world and mine. One bad month, one medical bill, one layoff, that is all it takes. The shelters were already announcing they would be over capacity, turning people away by lottery like some sick game show where the losers might freeze to death. Pete and I talked about our options that afternoon, sitting on milk crates behind the Vietnamese grocery store, where the owner sometimes let us warm up near the back vent. We decided to stick together, find a spot in the underground parking garage on Farnham Street, where the concrete held some heat from the cars coming and going. But Pete never showed up that night. I waited for him until almost 9, stomping my feet and blowing into my hands, watching my breath crystallize and disappear into the darkness. He had mentioned something about checking the recycling bins near the university. He collected cans and bottles to buy cigarettes, one of the few pleasures he had left. And I figured maybe he had found a better spot, or gotten into one of the church basements that sometimes opened during emergencies. I told myself not to worry, that Pete had survived worse winters than this, that he knew the tricks better than most. So I hunkered down alone in the corner of that parking garage, wrapped myself in every piece of fabric I owned, and tried to sleep while the wind howled outside like something hungry. My dreams were fragmented and strange, full of images of Ruth standing in a kitchen I had never seen, beckoning Pete toward a door filled with white light. I woke up around 4 in the morning, shaking uncontrollably, and I knew right then that something was wrong. The sun came up around 7:30, pale and distant like it was embarrassed to show its face after what the night had done. I started walking toward the university, retracing the route Pete usually took when he went collecting. The streets were quiet in that eerie way they get after a deep freeze. No joggers, no dog walkers, just the occasional car creeping along with frost still clinging to its windows. My boots crunched against the salted sidewalks, and every breath felt like inhaling broken glass. I checked the usual spots, the alley behind the student union where the recycling bins overflowed on weekends, the loading dock near the science building where warm air sometimes leaked from the ventilation system, the bus stop shelter on Dodge Street, where Pete liked to sit and watch the college kids go by. Nothing. No sign of him anywhere. A janitor coming out of one of the dormitories looked at me with that familiar mixture of pity and disgust, and I wanted to grab him by his clean uniform and ask if he had seen an old man with a yellow beard, but I knew how that would end. I found Pete in the narrow alley between a laundromat and a pawn shop on Leavenworth Street, about 6 blocks from where I had been searching. He was sitting upright against the brick wall, his legs stretched out in front of him, his hands resting on his thighs like he had just decided to take a break and catch his breath. For one horrible second, I thought he was alive. His eyes were open, staring straight ahead at the dumpster across from him, and there was an expression on his face that looked almost peaceful, like he had finally figured out the answer to a question that had been bothering him for years. But then I got closer and saw the frost on his eyelashes, the blue tint around his lips, the way his skin had taken on a waxy texture that no living person ever has. I said his name once, twice, 3 times, each time louder than the last. But my voice just bounced off the walls and disappeared into the frozen air. Pete was gone. He had been gone for hours, probably since sometime before midnight when the temperature had bottomed out and his body had simply surrendered to the cold. I sat down next to him on that frozen concrete, not caring anymore about preserving my own body heat, and I stayed there for what felt like an eternity. His shopping cart was parked a few feet away, still loaded with the plastic bags full of cans and bottles he had collected, maybe $8 worth if he was lucky. That is what his last hours on Earth had been spent doing, digging through trash so he could afford a pack of cigarettes and maybe a cup of coffee from the gas station. I noticed his gloves were missing, probably lost or stolen weeks ago. and his hands were bare and curled slightly inward like claws. The nails had turned a deep purple, almost black. I reached over and touched his shoulder, and it was like touching a statue, completely rigid and utterly foreign to anything resembling human warmth. A sound came out of my mouth that I did not recognize, something between a moan and a scream, and I pressed my forehead against his arm and let the grief tear through me like a winter wind, finding every crack in a broken window. Eventually, a woman walked by the alley entrance, probably on her way to work at one of the shops on the street. She glanced in, did a double take, and then pulled out her phone to call 911. I heard her voice high and panicked, describing what she saw. 2 homeless men, one possibly dead, please send someone quickly. She did not come any closer, did not ask if I was okay, did not offer any comfort at all. She just stood at the mouth of the alley with her phone pressed to her ear, watching us like we were animals at a zoo exhibit that had suddenly become disturbing instead of entertaining. The paramedics arrived about 15 minutes later, followed by a police cruiser with 2 officers who looked bored before they even got out of the car. One of them asked me if I knew the deceased, and I almost laughed at the word. Deceased, like Pete was just a file to be processed, a statistic to be recorded, a problem that had conveniently solved itself by dying in an alley where nobody important would have to see. They zipped Pete into a black body bag and loaded him into a van that did not even have windows in the back. I asked one of the paramedics where they would take him, and she told me the county morgue, where he would stay until they could locate next of kin or, failing that, arrange for a pauper's burial in the municipal cemetery. I thought about Pete's daughter, the one he had mentioned only once in all the time I knew him. She lived somewhere in California, had changed her phone number years ago after one too many desperate calls asking for money. He never blamed her for cutting him off. He said he understood that watching someone you love destroy themselves is its own kind of torture, that sometimes the kindest thing you can do is walk away before the drowning man pulls you under with him. But standing there watching that van drive away with his body inside, I wondered if she would ever find out, if some bureaucrat would track her down and deliver the news over the phone like it was an overdue library notice. Your father is dead. He froze to death behind a laundromat. Would you like to claim the body? Here is what people do not understand about dying from exposure. It is not like the movies where someone dramatically collapses in a snowbank. Hypothermia is slow and insidious and almost gentle in its cruelty. Your body starts by pulling blood away from your extremities, sacrificing your fingers and toes to keep your core warm, and you feel this deep, aching cold that settles into your bones like something alive. Then the shivering starts, violent and uncontrollable, your muscles burning through whatever energy you have left trying to generate heat. But eventually the shivering stops, and that is when you know you are in real trouble. Your body has given up the fight, accepted defeat, started shutting down systems one by one like a building going dark floor by floor. The strangest part is that near the end, many people actually feel warm. Their confused brains misinterpret the signals, and they start stripping off their clothes, convinced they are overheating. They call it paradoxical undressing, and it is one of the ways they identify hypothermia victims. Pete still had all his clothes on when I found him, so at least he was spared that final indignity. But I think about those last hours, alone in that alley, and I wonder if he called out for Ruth if he thought she was coming to take him home. The newspapers ran a small story the next day, buried somewhere in the local section between a report on a school board meeting and an advertisement for a furniture sale. Homeless man found dead in downtown alley, the headline read, and they did not even print his name. Just described him as a white male in his 50s, no identification found on his person. Cause of death presumed to be exposure to extreme cold. That was it. That was the sum total of Pete Garrison's obituary, a man who had fixed pipes and paid taxes and loved his wife and lived a whole entire life before the world decided he was disposable. The article mentioned that 3 other homeless individuals had died that same week across the city, bringing the season's total to 11. 11 people, frozen to death in a country that throws away enough food to feed entire nations. In a city with empty office buildings and heated parking garages and churches on every corner preaching about loving your neighbor. I kept that newspaper clipping for months, folded up in my coat pocket, until the paper turned soft and started falling apart along the creases. I wanted to remember the exact number, 11, because someone had to. A year has passed now, and I'm still here, still fighting the same war Pete lost. I found a spot in a transitional housing program last spring, a tiny room with a lock on the door and a radiator that clanks and hisses like an angry cat, but keeps me warm. I think about Pete every single day, especially when the temperature drops and I see the news reports about warming centers opening and donation drives collecting coats. The thing is, coats are not enough. Shelters are not enough. Not when there are more people than beds and the ones who get turned away have to flip a coin with their lives. What Pete needed, what all of us need, is for people to stop looking through us like we are ghosts, to stop treating homelessness like a personal failing instead of a systemic catastrophe. Pete did not die because he was weak or lazy or made bad choices. He died because a society that can afford to send rockets into space could not figure out how to keep a grieving old man from freezing to death 6 blocks from a heated shopping mall. I carry that truth with me now, carved into my chest like a scar that will never fully heal, and I share it with anyone willing to listen. Pete Garrison was my friend. He had a name, a history, a soul, and he deserved so much better than an unmarked grave in a frozen field at the edge of town. My car became my apartment on a rainy Wednesday in September, and I wish I could say it was dramatic or cinematic, but it wasn't. 6 months after graduating from Ohio State with a degree in communications, my apartment lease ended, and I had exactly $400 to my name. My roommate had moved to Seattle with her boyfriend, my temp job at the insurance company had dried up, and my parents, well, let's just say going back to their house in Akron wasn't an option after everything that happened. So, there I was, 24 years old with a journalism degree collecting dust, and my entire life crammed into the back seat of my 2009 Toyota Corolla. I had picked the McDonald's parking lot on Cedar Road in Beechwood because it stayed open late, had decent Wi-Fi that reached the parking lot, and the fluorescent lights made me feel slightly less alone. I told myself it would only be for a few weeks, just until I found something stable. That was 3 weeks ago, and I had developed a whole routine. Park in the same corner spot after 11, use the bathroom before they locked it, sleep with my pepper spray tucked between the driver's seat and the center console. That particular night was a Thursday in early October, and the temperature had dropped to maybe 45 degrees. I remember because I had layered 2 hoodies under my winter coat, and still woke up shivering around 2 in the morning. The parking lot was almost empty by then. Just my car, an old pickup truck near the drive-thru that had been there since before I arrived, and a white van parked way on the other end by the dumpsters. I had gotten used to sleeping light, waking up every time headlights swept across my windshield or someone walked too close to my car. But when I opened my eyes that night, something was different. The air inside the car felt wrong somehow, heavy and charged like the moment before a thunderstorm breaks. I blinked a few times trying to adjust to the darkness, and that's when I saw it. A shape outside my driver's side window, not moving, not walking past, just standing there completely still, maybe 6 inches from the glass. My first instinct was to scream, but nothing came out. It was a man. I could tell that much from the silhouette. Tall, maybe 6 feet, wearing what looked like a dark hoodie with the hood pulled up. His face was pressed so close to the window that his breath was fogging up the glass in small, rhythmic clouds. I could see the outline of his nose, his forehead, the way his hands were cupped around his eyes like he was trying to peer inside a store window, like he was window shopping. For a few seconds, that felt like hours. I just lay there frozen in my reclined seat, praying that he couldn't see me through the condensation that had built up on the inside of the windows. My heart was pounding so hard, I was sure he could hear it. I didn't move, I didn't breathe, I just watched those little clouds of breath appear and disappear on the glass, over and over, while my mind raced through every possible scenario of what was about to happen. Then he moved to the back window. I heard his footsteps on the asphalt, slow, deliberate, unhurried, and watched his shadow drift past my peripheral vision until he stopped right behind me. The back seat was stuffed with everything I owned. Clothes in garbage bags, a small cooler, my laptop bag, a pillow and blanket that I used every night. He stood there for what must have been 2 full minutes, just looking at my things, and I realized with a sickening clarity that he knew. He knew someone was living in this car. He had probably been watching me for days, maybe weeks, learning my routine, figuring out when I was most vulnerable. The thought made my chest tighten so hard I thought I might pass out. I could hear him breathing now, or maybe I was imagining it. Every sound was amplified in that silence. The distant hum of the highway, a car door slamming somewhere far away, and underneath it all the soft shuffle of his shoes as he moved again. He came back to the driver's side. This time he didn't just look. I heard the click of the door handle being tested, a gentle pull at first, then harder. The whole car rocked slightly with the force of it. My locks were down. I always triple-checked before sleeping. But the sound of someone trying to get into your space, your only space in the entire world, is something that stays with you. He tried again, yanking now, and I could hear him grunt with the effort. Then his face appeared at the window once more, and this time he was closer, his features slightly visible in the orange glow of the parking lot lights. He looked normal. That was the worst part. Not some wild-eyed maniac, not obviously dangerous. Just a regular guy, maybe in his 40s, with a receding hairline and stubble on his chin. The kind of face you would pass in a grocery store without a second glance. He smiled at the window, and even though I knew he probably couldn't see me clearly, it felt like he was smiling directly at me. I don't know where the courage came from, but something in me snapped. Maybe it was the smile, or maybe it was the realization that if I didn't do something, I would just lie there paralyzed until he found a way in. I grabbed the pepper spray from beside my seat, sat up as fast as I could, and slammed my palm against the horn. The sound exploded through the empty parking lot like a bomb going off. The man stumbled backward, his face twisting from that calm smile into something like shock, and for a split second we just stared at each other through the glass. I kept my hand on the horn, the noise blaring, and with my other hand I held up the pepper spray so he could see it. I was screaming too, I think, though I don't remember what words came out. Probably nothing coherent. Just raw sound, all the fear and anger and helplessness of the past 3 weeks pouring out of me in one primal burst. He ran, not toward me, thank God, but away, cutting across the parking lot toward the white van by the dumpsters. I watched him go, still leaning on the horn, my whole body trembling so violently that my teeth were chattering. The van's headlights came on, and within seconds, it was peeling out of the lot, tires squealing against the pavement. I caught a glimpse of the license plate, partial, just the first 3 characters, BKV, before it disappeared onto Cedar Road, heading east. Only then did I take my hand off the horn. The silence that followed was almost worse than the noise. My ears were ringing, my throat was raw, and I realized I was crying. Not soft tears, but the ugly kind. The kind where your whole face contorts and snot runs down your lip and you can't catch your breath. I sat there in the driver's seat, pepper spray still clutched in my fist, and I cried until I couldn't anymore. The McDonald's night manager came out about 5 minutes later. Her name was Brianna, a heavy-set black woman in her 50s with reading glasses pushed up on her forehead, and a look on her face that was equal parts concern and annoyance. She had heard the horn from inside and wanted to know what the hell was going on. Tried to explain through my hiccups and shaky breath. The man, the window, the door handle. And I watched her expression shift from irritation to something softer, something like pity. She asked if I was living in my car, and I couldn't lie. Not in that moment. I just nodded. She didn't say anything judgmental, didn't tell me I couldn't park there anymore, didn't give me a lecture about making better choices. She just handed me a cup of hot coffee through my cracked window and told me she was calling the police. I wanted to hug her. I also wanted to disappear into the seat cushions and never be seen again. The police arrived about 20 minutes later, 2 officers in a Beechwood cruiser. A younger guy with a buzz cut and an older woman with graying hair pulled back in a tight bun. They took my statement in the parking lot while Brianna watched from the doorway, arms crossed against the cold. I told them everything. The man, the hoodie, the way he had pressed his face to the glass, the partial plate number. The younger cop wrote it all down in a little notebook while the older one walked around my car with a flashlight, checking for any signs of tampering. She found smudges on the driver's side window where his face had been, and greasy fingerprints around the door handle. They took photos. The whole time, I could feel them looking at my car differently, seeing the garbage bags of clothes, the pillow in the back seat, the empty fast food wrappers I hadn't had a chance to throw away. I knew what they were thinking. I had seen that look before, from people at gas stations and rest stops, the look that says, "How did you end up like this?" without actually asking the question. The older officer, whose name tag read Sergeant Kimball, asked me how long I'd been sleeping in the parking lot. I told her 3 weeks. She asked if I had anywhere else to go, any family or friends who could take me in. I said no, which was mostly true. She didn't push. Instead, she gave me a card for a women's shelter about 15 minutes away and told me that what happened tonight could have ended very differently. She wasn't being cruel about it, just matter of fact, but her words hit me like a punch to the chest. I knew she was right. If my doors hadn't been locked, if I hadn't woken up when I did, if I hadn't had the pepper spray within reach, the possibilities unfolded in my mind like a horror movie I couldn't turn off. The younger cop said they would put out an alert for the white van, but his tone suggested he didn't expect much to come of it. Partial plates, dark parking lot, no witnesses besides me. I understood. I wasn't naive enough to think they would catch him. After the police left, Brianna let me come inside to use the bathroom and wash my face. The fluorescent lights in there were brutal, and when I looked in the mirror, I barely recognized myself. My eyes were swollen and red, my skin pale and blotchy, my hair a tangled mess from sleeping on it wrong. I looked like someone who'd been living in a car for 3 weeks, which I guess made sense. I splashed cold water on my face and tried to pull myself together, but my hands wouldn't stop trembling. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw his face at the window, that ordinary face with that terrible smile. Brianna was waiting for me when I came out, holding a bag with 2 cheeseburgers and a large fry. "On the house," she said. I started crying again, which was embarrassing, but she just patted my shoulder and told me to take care of myself. She said she had a daughter about my age, and the thought of her being out there alone in a parking lot made her sick to her stomach. I didn't know what to say to that, so I just thanked her and went back to my car. I didn't sleep the rest of that night. I drove to a different parking lot, a Walmart about 10 miles away, and sat there with my doors locked and my pepper spray in my lap until the sun came up. Every van that passed made my heart race. Every person who walked too close to my car sent me into a spiral of panic. When morning finally came, I called the shelter that Sergeant Kimball had mentioned. They had a bed available, and I took it. I stayed there for 6 weeks, long enough to save up for a deposit on a tiny studio apartment in Cleveland Heights, long enough to get a job at a call center that paid barely above minimum wage, but at least paid something. I never went back to that McDonald's. I never saw the man in the white van again, though sometimes I wonder if he found someone else, someone whose doors weren't locked, someone who didn't wake up in time. That thought keeps me up at night more than any memory of his face at my window. I got lucky. I know that now. And I hate that luck is what it takes to survive when you have nothing and nowhere to go. Running away from home felt like freedom for about 3 days. After that, it just felt like being hungry and cold and scared all the time. I was 17, a junior who should have been worrying about SATs and prom dates, but instead I found myself sleeping on a bench in Riverside Park with a bunch of guys who had been living on the streets for years. My parents and I had been fighting constantly since my dad lost his job, and one night after a screaming match about my grades, I just packed a backpack and left. I thought I was making some kind of statement. I thought they would come looking for me, beg me to come back. Nobody came. I had $40 in my pocket when I left, and by the fourth day, I had nothing. Pride is a stupid thing when your stomach is eating itself. The group I fell in with was mostly harmless. There was an older guy everyone called Patches because of his jacket, and a woman named Rita, who talked to herself but always shared her food when she had some. A younger guy, maybe mid-20s, named Scotty, who had bad teeth and a nervous laugh. And then there was Carl. Carl was different from the others. He was quiet, kept to himself, and the other homeless people seemed to avoid him. He was maybe 50, with a gray beard and these watery blue eyes that never seemed to focus on anything. He had a shopping cart full of stuff he guarded like it was gold, and he slept on the far end of our little camp, away from everyone else. The others whispered that Carl had money hidden somewhere, that he was sitting on a small fortune but was too crazy to spend it. I never believed that. But I did notice that Carl always had food, snacks, granola bars, sometimes even sandwiches. And on the fifth night, when I had not eaten anything in almost 2 days, I could not stop staring at his cart. It was around 2 in the morning when I made my decision. Everyone was asleep, or at least pretending to be. The park was dead quiet except for the occasional car passing on the street beyond the trees. I'd been lying on my bench for hours, unable to sleep because my stomach kept cramping up. The hunger was not like anything I had experienced before. It was not just discomfort anymore. It was pain, real pain, like something was clawing at my insides. I watched Carl sleeping near his cart, wrapped in a dirty sleeping bag, and I told myself it was just a candy bar. Just one candy bar. He had plenty. He would not even notice. I got up slowly, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat, and I crept over to his cart. My hands found a Snickers bar near the top of one of his plastic bags. I grabbed it and went back to my bench. The whole thing took maybe 15 seconds. I ate that candy bar in 3 bites, barely even tasting it, just shoving it into my mouth like an animal. The next morning started like any other. People waking up slowly, shuffling around, Rita mumbling her usual nonsense while she folded her blankets. I was still hungry, but the edge was off and I felt something close to relief. That relief lasted about 20 minutes. That was when Carl woke up and started going through his cart. I watched him from across the camp, pretending to be busy with my backpack, but I could see everything. He was counting his things, checking his bags, and then he stopped. His whole body went stiff. He checked again, more frantically this time, digging through the plastic bags and pulling things out. Then he stood up and looked around the camp with those watery eyes, and for a second I thought he was looking right at me. My chest got tight, but his gaze moved past me and landed on Scotty, who was sitting on a milk crate about 10 feet away from Carl's cart, closer than anyone else. Scotty had no idea what was happening. He was just sitting there, picking at his fingernails, not paying attention to anything. Carl walked over to Scotty with this slow, deliberate pace that made my stomach turn. He stopped right in front of him and just stood there for a moment, staring down. Scotty looked up with that nervous smile of his, the one that showed his bad teeth, and said something like, "Hey man, what's up?" Carl did not answer. He just asked, real quiet, where his stuff was. Scotty looked confused. He said he did not know what Carl was talking about. Carl asked again, louder this time, and I could hear the edge in his voice. He said someone took food from his cart, and Scotty was sleeping right next to it. Scotty started shaking his head, saying it was not him. He did not take anything. He would never do that. But Carl was not listening. The other people in the camp were starting to pay attention now. Patches stood up from his spot near the fountain, watching. Rita stopped her mumbling. Everyone was looking at Carl and Scotty, and I was just sitting there on my bench, frozen, with the taste of that Snickers bar still in my mouth. I should have said something. That is what I tell myself now, years later. I should have stood up and admitted what I did, but I was 17 and scared and stupid, and I just sat there watching it unfold like it was happening on a television screen. Carl grabbed Scotty by the front of his jacket and yanked him off the milk crate. Scotty was smaller than Carl, skinnier, weaker. He tried to pull away, but Carl had him good. He kept saying it was not him, please, it was not him. But Carl just kept asking where his stuff was, over and over, getting louder each time. Then Carl threw the first punch. It caught Scotty right in the face, and I heard this sound, this wet smacking sound that I can still hear when I close my eyes at night. Scotty went down hard, and Carl got on top of him. The other homeless people just watched. Nobody moved to help. Nobody said anything. I think they were all scared of Carl, or maybe they just did not want to get involved. Either way, they just stood there, and so did I. What happened next is something I have never been able to fully describe to anyone. Carl beat Scotty for what felt like forever, but was probably only a few minutes. He punched him in the face, in the ribs, in the stomach. Scotty tried to cover himself, curling up into a ball on the ground, but Carl just kept going. At some point, Scotty stopped making sounds. He stopped trying to protect himself. His arms just fell to his sides and he lay there, and Carl kept hitting him. I remember the sounds more than anything else. The dull thud of fists on flesh. Carl breathing heavy, grunting with each swing. And this horrible gurgling noise coming from Scotty, like he was trying to breathe through liquid. I wanted to scream, to run, to do something, but my body would not move. It was like my feet were nailed to the ground. I just stood there watching a man get beaten half to death because I stole a candy bar, because I was hungry and selfish and too much of a coward to speak up. Carl finally stopped when he ran out of energy. He was panting, his knuckles bloody, and he just stood over Scotty for a long moment staring down at what he had done. Then he spit on him and walked back to his cart like nothing happened. Scotty was not moving. His face was unrecognizable, swollen and bloody, and there was this dark puddle forming under his head on the concrete. Rita started crying, these quiet little sobs that sounded more like hiccups. Patches pulled out an old flip phone and said he was calling an ambulance. Carl just sat down by his cart and started eating a granola bar, calm as anything, like he had just finished doing some light exercise. Nobody looked at me. Nobody suspected the skinny teenager who had only been there a few days. Why would they? I was just some runaway kid. Scotty was the one who slept closest to Carl's cart. It made sense that it was him. Except, it was not him. It was me. And Scotty was lying on the ground, maybe dying because of me. The ambulance took almost 20 minutes to arrive. 20 minutes of me sitting on that bench, staring at Scotty's body, waiting for him to move or make a sound or do anything that would tell me he was still alive. He did not move. His chest was rising and falling, but barely, and the blood kept spreading under his head. When the paramedics finally showed up, they worked on him for a long time before loading him onto a stretcher. One of them asked what happened, and Patches just said there was a fight, some dispute over stolen property. The paramedic looked around at all of us, these dirty homeless people standing in a city park at 7 in the morning, and I could see the judgment in his eyes. He did not ask any more questions. The cops came a little while later, 2 officers who took statements from Patches and Rita, but did not seem too interested in investigating further. Carl had already disappeared by then, slipped away with his cart while everyone was focused on Scotty. One of the cops asked me if I saw anything, and I said I was asleep when it started. I lied right to his face. He wrote something in his little notebook and walked away, and that was it. Nobody was going to look too hard into a fight between homeless guys in a park. I left the camp about an hour after the cops drove off. I did not say goodbye to anyone. I just grabbed my backpack and started walking, no destination in mind, just needing to move, to get away from that spot where Scotty's blood was still drying on the concrete. I walked for hours through the city, past shops and restaurants and normal people living their normal lives. And I kept thinking about what I had done. Not just the stealing, but the silence, the cowardice. I had watched an innocent man get beaten almost to death, and I had said nothing. I had lied to the police. I was complicit in something terrible, and there was no way to undo it. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Scotty's face, the way it looked before and the way it looked after, and I heard that gurgling sound he made when he stopped being able to breathe right. I found a payphone around noon. I do not even know why I stopped there. My feet just carried me to it, and before I knew what I was doing, I was dialing my home number. My mom answered on the second ring. She did not yell at me. That was the thing that broke me. I expected screaming, anger, all the things we had been throwing at each other for months. Instead, her voice cracked and she just said my name over and over, like she could not believe it was really me. She asked where I was, if I was okay, if I was hurt. I could hear my dad in the background asking who was on the phone, and then I heard him make this sound when she told him it was me. This choked, desperate sound that I had never heard him make before. I told them where I was, some intersection downtown that I barely recognized, and my mom said they were coming to get me. Just stay there. Do not move. They were coming. I hung up and sat down on the curb and I started crying. Not quiet crying either, but ugly, loud sobbing that made people on the street stare at me as they walked past. I cried for Scotty, who might have been dead by then for all I knew. I cried for myself, for how stupid and selfish I had been. I cried because my parents still loved me even after everything, and I did not deserve it. My dad's truck pulled up about 40 minutes later, and when he got out and saw me sitting there on that curb, dirty and skinny and broken, he did not say a word. He just walked over and hugged me so hard I thought my ribs would crack. I never told them what really happened in that park. I never told anyone until now. I said I had been sleeping rough, that it was hard, that I wanted to come home. All of that was true, just not the whole truth. I went back to school, finished my junior year, graduated the next spring. I went to community college, got a job, built something like a normal life. But I never stopped thinking about Scotty. I looked for news about him for months afterward, searched online for any reports about a homeless man beaten in Riverside Park, but I never found anything. I do not know if he lived or died. I do not know if Carl was ever caught. That uncertainty is its own kind of punishment, I think. Some nights I still dream about it. I am back on that bench, watching Carl walk towards Scotty, and I open my mouth to say it was me. I took it. Leave him alone. But no sound comes out. I just sit there silent, while it happens all over again. I am 24 now, and I have not stolen anything since that morning. Not a candy bar, not a pen, not anything. It does not make up for what I did. Nothing ever will. But it is the only promise I know how to keep. November can be cruel in Portland, Oregon, and that year it arrived with a vengeance that cut right through whatever layers you managed to pile on. My high school class had graduated back in 2009, and while most of them were building careers and families, I had been sleeping under bridges and in parking garages for the better part of 3 years. A bad divorce, a worse drinking problem, and a series of choices I still regret led me to lose my job as a warehouse supervisor, and eventually my apartment. By the time that particular Friday night rolled around, I had learned the rhythm of street survival pretty well. You find your spots, you learn which shelters have beds and which ones are just trouble, and most importantly, you find your people. That night, I was heading toward an abandoned lot off Burnside, where a group of us had been gathering for weeks. It was hidden behind a crumbling brick building that used to be a print shop, shielded from the main road by overgrown bushes and a chain-link fence with a convenient hole near the back corner. When I squeezed through that gap in the fence around 8 in the evening, there were already 5 others huddled around a rusted oil barrel that Jerome had dragged there a month before. Jerome was a Vietnam vet, probably in his late 60s, with a gray beard that reached his chest and eyes that had seen too much of everything. He had this way of keeping things calm in the group, a quiet authority that came from experience rather than intimidation. Next to him sat a woman everyone called Birdie, because she was always feeding the pigeons with whatever bread scraps she could find. There was also Tommy, a skinny kid who could not have been older than 22, running from something he never talked about, and the Pratt brothers, Lenny and Gus, who had been homeless together since their mother died and left them with nothing but debt. The fire inside that barrel was the only warm thing for blocks, and we guarded it like it was sacred. That night started out like any other. We passed around a bottle of cheap whiskey that Gus had managed to get from somewhere, and Jerome told one of his stories about his time in Da Nang. Bertie hummed to herself while she sorted through a plastic bag full of things she had collected throughout the day, little treasures that meant nothing to anyone else but everything to her. I had managed to score a pretty decent haul from the dumpster behind a grocery store on Hawthorne. A few bruised apples, half a loaf of bread that was only slightly stale, and 2 cans of beans that were dented but still sealed. I shared what I had because that was how things worked with us. You gave when you could and took when you needed. No questions asked and no debts kept. The fire crackled and popped inside the barrel, sending little sparks up into the black sky, and for a moment it almost felt peaceful. The temperature had dropped to somewhere around 30 degrees, and you could see your breath forming thick clouds every time you exhaled. We all stayed close to that barrel, shoulders nearly touching, drawing whatever warmth we could from the flames and from each other. The trouble walked through that hole in the fence around 10:30, wearing a torn army jacket and carrying a backpack that looked stuffed to bursting. His name was Ray Durkin, and everybody on the streets knew to stay clear of him. He was maybe 45, built like a man who had done time and used every minute of it in the prison yard, with a shaved head covered in poorly done tattoos and a scar that ran from his left eyebrow down to his jaw. Ray had a reputation for violence that was well earned. I had seen him break a man's arm over a sleeping spot near the Willamette River 2 winters ago, and the sound of that bone snapping still visited me in my sleep sometimes. He walked into our circle like he owned the place, dropped his backpack on the ground with a heavy thud, and immediately started warming his hands over our fire without so much as a nod to anyone. Jerome tensed up beside me, and I noticed Tommy slowly inching backward into the shadows. Even Lenny, who was usually quick with a joke or a comment, went completely silent. For a while, nobody said anything. We just sat there in that uncomfortable quiet, the fire crackling between us, Ray standing on the opposite side of the barrel with his eyes scanning each of us like he was sizing up prey. Jerome finally broke the silence by offering Ray a pull from the whiskey bottle, a peace gesture that I had seen him use before to diffuse tense situations. Ray snatched it without a word, took 3 long gulps, and then wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. He did not offer it back. Instead, he set it down on the ground next to his backpack and started rummaging through his things, pulling out a filthy sleeping bag and a tarp that looked like it had been dragged through mud. Bertie kept her head down, her fingers still moving nervously through her plastic bag, and I could hear her breathing getting faster. I wanted to say something, to tell Ray that there were other spots he could use, but I knew better than to put a target on myself. So I just sat there, my jaw tight, watching him settle in like a storm cloud that had decided to park itself right in the middle of our little haven. The argument started about an hour later, and it came out of nowhere like a punch you do not see coming. Gus had been getting more and more agitated as the night wore on, whispering things to Lenny that I could not quite catch. At some point, Ray must have heard something because his head snapped toward the brothers and his face went hard as concrete. He stood up slowly, and even though the fire was between them, I could feel the heat of his anger radiating stronger than any flame. He pointed a thick finger at Gus and asked him where his jacket was, the army jacket he was wearing. Gus stammered something about finding it, that he had pulled it from a donation bin outside a church on Glisson Street 3 weeks ago. But Ray was not having it. He crossed around the barrel in 4 quick steps and grabbed Gus by the collar of that jacket, lifting him halfway off the ground like he weighed nothing. That jacket was his, Ray said through clenched teeth, stolen from his camp 2 months back when he was doing a stint in county lockup for assault. Whether it was true or not, I could not say, but in that moment, it did not matter. The truth rarely matters when a violent man decides he has been wronged. Lenny jumped up to defend his brother, which was exactly the wrong thing to do. He shoved Ray hard in the chest, trying to break his grip on Gus, and for a second, it actually worked. Ray stumbled back a step, releasing Gus, who fell to the ground, gasping and clutching at his throat. But then Ray's face changed into something I can only describe as empty, like a switch had been flipped, and whatever humanity was behind those eyes just turned off. He came at Lenny with a fury that was terrifying to witness, throwing punches that connected with wet, heavy sounds against flesh and bone. Jerome tried to intervene, grabbing Ray's arm from behind, but Ray spun around and caught him in the temple with an elbow that sent the old man sprawling into the dirt. Birdie was screaming now, this high-pitched wail that seemed to echo off the brick walls surrounding us. I was on my feet, but my legs would not move, stuck somewhere between the instinct to help and the instinct to survive. Tommy had already disappeared through the hole in the fence. Smart kid. The whole scene unfolded in what felt like slow motion, but was probably only 15 or 20 seconds of pure chaos. That was when it happened. Ray had Lenny pinned against the ground, still swinging even though Lenny had stopped fighting back, and Gus came at him from behind with a piece of broken concrete he had grabbed from somewhere. He brought it down hard on Ray's shoulder, not his head, just his shoulder, but it was enough to make Ray howl in pain and roll off his brother. Ray scrambled to his feet, his face twisted with rage, and he lunged toward the oil barrel. I thought he was trying to grab something to use as a weapon, maybe one of the pieces of scrap wood we had been feeding the fire with, but instead, he just shoved the whole thing over in one violent motion, like he wanted to burn the whole world down if he could not win the fight. The barrel tipped with a horrible metallic screech, and the burning wood and embers inside spilled out across the dry weeds and trash that covered the ground of that lot. For a moment, we all just stood there, frozen, watching those little flames catch and spread like living things searching for something to devour. The fire moved faster than I ever thought possible. One second it was just a few patches of burning weeds, and the next it was a wall of orange and yellow racing across the lot toward the old print shop building. The dry autumn had turned everything into kindling, the dead grass, the piles of cardboard we used for bedding, the wooden pallets stacked against the fence. All of it went up like it had been soaked in gasoline. The heat hit me in a wave that made me stagger backward, and the smoke came right after, thick and black and choking. I heard Birdie coughing somewhere to my left, and I reached out blindly, grabbed her arm and started pulling her toward the hole in the fence. Jerome was already on his feet, blood running down the side of his face from where Ray had elbowed him, and he was yelling at the Pratt brothers to move, but Lenny was not moving. He was still on the ground where Ray had left him, curled up on his side, and Gus was trying to drag him away from the flames that were creeping closer with every passing second. Ray had vanished, slipped away into the smoke and the night like the coward he was, leaving the rest of us to deal with the nightmare he had created. I got Birdie to the fence and practically shoved her through the hole, screaming at her to run and not look back. Then I turned around and ran back into that hellscape because I could not leave the others behind. The smoke was so thick now that I could barely see 3 feet in front of me, and the heat was unbearable, pressing against my skin like a physical weight. I found Jerome first, stumbling in the wrong direction, disoriented from the blow to his head. I grabbed his arm and pointed him toward the fence, told him to follow the brick wall and he would find the gap. Then I went looking for Gus and Lenny. I found them near the center of the lot, surrounded by flames on 3 sides. Gus had managed to get Lenny sitting up, but Lenny's face was a mess of blood and swelling, and one of his eyes was completely shut. His left arm hung at an angle that made my stomach turn, clearly broken in at least one place. The fire had reached a pile of old tires near the edge of the lot, and the flames shooting up from that were like something out of a horror movie, black smoke billowing up in a column that blocked out the stars above us. I knew we had maybe 30 seconds before our only escape route was cut off. I grabbed Lenny's good arm and threw it over my shoulder while Gus took the other side, and together we half carried, half dragged him toward the fence. Lenny was screaming with every step, this raw animal sound that I still hear sometimes when the night gets too quiet. The fire was roaring now, an actual roar like some giant beast breathing down our necks, and I could feel the hair on my arms singeing from the heat. Sparks were raining down on us like burning snow, landing on our clothes, our skin, leaving little stinging kisses that we did not have time to acknowledge. We reached the fence just as the flames engulfed the spot where we had been standing moments before. I pushed Lenny through the hole first, as gently as I could manage, which was not very gentle at all, and Gus scrambled through after him. I was the last one out. and as I squeezed through that gap in the chain link, I felt the metal hot against my palms, heated by the inferno just feet away. We collapsed on the sidewalk on the other side, all of us gasping and coughing, our lungs full of smoke and our eyes streaming tears. Behind us, the entire lot was ablaze, flames reaching up toward the sky like fingers trying to grab the moon. Someone in one of the nearby buildings must have called the fire department because I could hear sirens in the distance, getting closer. That sound triggered something primal in all of us. Jerome looked at me with those tired, bloodshot eyes, and just shook his head slowly before limping off into the darkness between buildings. Bertie was already gone, disappeared the moment she had cleared the fence. Gus looked at his brother, looked at me, and I saw the impossible choice playing out across his face. If we stayed, the paramedics would help Lenny, but the police would come too. Warrants, questions, the system that had failed every single one of us in different ways would swallow us whole again. But if we ran, Lenny might not make it through the night with those injuries. I made the decision for him. I told Gus to take his brother and go, that I would stay and flag down the ambulance, give them a fake name, tell them I found Lenny like this on the street. Gus hesitated for just a second, then nodded and started dragging Lenny away from the growing glow of the fire. I sat down on that cold sidewalk and waited for the red and blue lights to arrive, rehearsing my lie, trying to stop my whole body from shaking as the adrenaline drained away and left nothing but exhaustion and a sadness so heavy I could barely breathe. The paramedics found me sitting there about 5 minutes later, covered in soot and smelling like a chimney. I told them exactly what I had planned, that I was walking by and found an injured man on the sidewalk, that I had no idea what happened to him. They did not believe me. I could see it in their eyes, but they also did not care enough to press. They had a patient to stabilize and a fire to stay clear of, and some homeless guy's story was the least of their concerns. The firefighters arrived right after, 3 trucks that lit up the whole block with their flashing lights, and they got to work on the blaze that had now spread to the old print shop. I watched from across the street as they battled it for nearly 2 hours, eventually bringing it under control, but not before the building was gutted completely. A police officer took my statement, wrote down the fake name I gave him, and told me I was free to go. I walked away from that scene with nothing but the burned clothes on my back and lungs that would ache for weeks afterward. I found out later that Lenny survived. Gus got him to a clinic on the east side run by volunteers who did not ask questions, and they patched him up well enough. His arm healed crooked and he lost most of the vision in his left eye, but he lived. That was more than I expected when I saw him lying in that burning lot. I never saw Ray Durkin again after that night, though I heard rumors over the years. Some said he got picked up on a 3rd strike charge and was doing 25 to life somewhere in California. Others said he froze to death under an overpass in Seattle during a cold snap. I like to believe the second one, if I am being truthful, because it feels like some kind of justice, even though I know that is a dark thing to wish on another person. The rest of our little group scattered after the fire. Jerome moved south, said the cold was getting too hard on his bones. Bertie ended up in a women's shelter and last I heard actually got into a transitional housing program. Tommy I never saw again, just vanished like he was never there at all. As for me, that night changed something inside my chest, cracked something open that had been sealed shut for a long time. I checked myself into a detox program 3 weeks later, got clean, got a job washing dishes at a restaurant downtown, and slowly started climbing back towards something resembling a life. I still think about that night whenever November rolls around and the air gets that particular kind of cold. I think about how fast everything can fall apart, how a single act of violence can destroy the fragile peace that people build when they have nothing else. And I think about Jerome passing that whiskey bottle to Ray, trying to keep the peace, not knowing that some fires are already burning long before the first spark ever catches. Sleeping under a bridge in March will make you do things you swore you would never do. I had been homeless in Columbus, Ohio for about 4 months when that night happened. and by then I had already broken most of my own rules just to survive. Before the streets, I worked at a warehouse, had roommates, paid bills on time. Then everything fell apart in a matter of weeks. The warehouse shut down, I got pneumonia, my roommates left, and my landlord started eviction proceedings while I was still coughing up mucus in a free clinic waiting room. My mom died when I was 19, and I never knew my father, so there was no safety net waiting for me. The friends I had from high school were scattered across different states, living their own lives, and I was too ashamed to reach out and admit what had happened to me. Being a woman on the streets teaches you things fast. You learn to trust your gut, to avoid certain areas after dark, to never let anyone know where you sleep. I met him on a Thursday evening outside a coffee shop on High Street. It was cold, the kind of cold that seeps into your bones and makes your teeth ache. I was sitting on the sidewalk, my back against the brick wall, hoping someone might buy me a hot drink or drop some change. He came out of the shop holding 2 cups and offered me one without a word. Medium build, maybe early 40s, clean-shaven, wearing a gray wool coat that looked expensive. His name was Gary, he said, and he volunteered at a shelter downtown sometimes. We talked for maybe 10 minutes, just normal conversation. The weather, how hard the winter had been, how the city should do more for people like me. He had this calm, gentle way of speaking, like a therapist or a pastor. When he offered me $50 and a warm place to sleep for the night, no strings attached, I wanted to say no. Every instinct I had developed on the streets told me to refuse. But I was exhausted, freezing, and he seemed so sincere. I told myself I could handle whatever happened. I was wrong about that in ways I still have nightmares about. His car was a dark blue sedan, clean inside, smelling like pine air freshener. He drove carefully, obeying every speed limit, using his turn signals. We made small talk during the ride, and he asked me questions about myself, where I was from, how long I had been on the streets, if I had any family. I kept my answers vague, which he seemed to respect. He told me he lived alone, had been divorced for a few years, worked in insurance claims. Everything about him screamed ordinary. The drive took about 20 minutes, heading into a residential area I did not recognize. Lots of older houses set back from the road with big yards. His place was a 2-story house at the end of a quiet cul-de-sac. No neighbors within shouting distance. That detail registered in my mind, but I pushed it aside. He pulled into the garage and the door closed behind us automatically before we even got out of the car. I remember thinking that was a little strange, but I told myself rich people just had different habits. Inside, the house was neat, almost too neat. Everything looked like it belonged in a catalog. Matching furniture, no dust, no clutter, no personal photos on the walls. He gave me a quick tour of the first floor, living room, kitchen, a small bathroom. He pointed toward a hallway and mentioned that the basement was off limits because he used it for storage, and it was a mess. The way he said it, casual but firm, made me glance at the door. It had a heavy deadbolt on it, the kind you would see on an exterior door, not on a basement entrance. I noticed another door near the kitchen with the same type of lock. He caught me looking and smiled. Said he was paranoid about break-ins since his divorce. That explanation made sense on the surface, but something in my chest tightened. I had learned to pay attention to that feeling over the past months. It had kept me safe more than once. But I was inside now, warm for the first time in days, and I convinced myself I was overreacting. He offered me a shower and clean clothes, said his ex-wife had left some things behind that might fit me. The bathroom upstairs was spotless, white tiles, fluffy towels, expensive-looking soap. I locked the door and checked the lock twice before undressing. The hot water felt incredible, and I stayed under the spray longer than I should have, letting the warmth soak into my muscles. When I got out, I noticed there was no window in the bathroom. Just smooth drywall where a window should have been. The clothes he left outside the door were folded neatly. Sweatpants, a long-sleeve shirt, thick socks. They smelled like fabric softener. I put them on and came downstairs to find him in the kitchen, heating up soup on the stove. He had set the table with 2 bowls, 2 spoons, napkins, like we were old friends having dinner together. The soup was chicken noodle from a can, nothing fancy. He sat across from me and watched me eat with this expression I could not quite read. Not hungry, not impatient, just watching. I finished the bowl faster than I meant to, and he immediately offered me more. After dinner, he showed me the guest room where I would be sleeping. It was upstairs at the end of the hallway, with a single bed and a dresser and nothing else. No lamp, no nightstand, no decorations. The window had thick curtains drawn across it, and when I pulled them back slightly, I saw metal bars on the outside of the glass. Security bars, the kind people install in bad neighborhoods to prevent break-ins. But this was not a bad neighborhood, and every other house I had seen on the drive had normal windows. I asked him about it and he shrugged, said the previous owners must have installed them. He had just never bothered to remove them. His voice was calm, but his eyes stayed fixed on my face a beat too long. I told him I was tired and wanted to sleep. He nodded, wished me good night, and closed the door behind him. I waited until his footsteps faded down the hallway, then tried the door handle. It turned, the door opened. I exhaled. Maybe I really was just being paranoid. I left the door open a crack and lay down on the bed, still wearing my shoes. I must have dozed off because the next thing I remember is waking up to the sound of the door clicking shut. The room was dark, completely dark, and I could not see anything. I reached for my phone out of habit before remembering I had not had a working phone in months. I stayed perfectly still, listening. Footsteps in the hallway, slow and deliberate, then silence. I slid off the bed as quietly as I could and moved toward the door. When I grabbed the handle and turned it, nothing happened. The door was locked from the outside. My heart started pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. I tried again, twisting the handle harder, pulling, pushing. Nothing. I pressed my ear against the wood and heard breathing on the other side, steady and patient, like someone waiting. I backed away from the door and stumbled into the dresser, knocking something to the floor. The breathing stopped. Then footsteps again, moving away down the hall. I stood there in the darkness, shaking, trying to figure out what to do next. I felt my way along the wall until I found the window. The curtains were heavy and I yanked them aside, letting in a sliver of light from somewhere outside. A street lamp maybe, or the moon. The bars on the window were solid, bolted into the frame from the outside. I pushed against them anyway, knowing it was useless. My eyes adjusted slowly and I started searching the room for anything I could use. The dresser was empty, every drawer bare. The bed had no frame, just a mattress on the floor. No closet, no objects, nothing. It was like a cell designed to look like a bedroom. I went back to the door and examined it more closely. The lock was a simple latch mechanism, the kind that could be opened with a flathead screwdriver or a butter knife. I did not have either, but I did have a zipper on my jacket, a metal one with teeth. I took the jacket off and tried to work the zipper pull into the gap between the door and the frame, aiming for the latch. My fingers were clumsy with fear, but I kept trying, scraping and pushing, for what felt like an hour. The latch finally gave with a small click that sounded impossibly loud in the silence. I froze, waiting for footsteps, waiting for him to come running. Nothing. I eased the door open inch by inch, holding my breath. The hallway was dark, but I could see a faint glow coming from downstairs. Maybe a television or a lamp left on. I stepped out of the room and immediately noticed another door across the hall, one I had not seen during the brief tour. It was slightly open, and through the gap I could see a desk covered in monitors, 4 or 5 of them, showing different angles of the house. The guest room, the bathroom, the kitchen, the garage. He had cameras everywhere. On one of the screens I saw myself, a grainy figure standing frozen in the hallway, and I realized he could be watching me right now from anywhere in the house. I forced myself to move, heading toward the stairs, staying close to the wall to avoid any creaky floorboards. Every step felt like a gamble. I made it to the top of the staircase and looked down into the living room below. Empty. The front door was maybe 30 feet away. I was halfway down the stairs when I heard his voice behind me, calm and almost friendly. He said my name, the fake name I had given him earlier, and asked where I was going. I did not turn around. I ran. I took the stairs 2 at a time, nearly tripping at the bottom, and sprinted for the front door. My hand hit the deadbolt and I twisted it, yanked the door open, and felt the cold night air on my face for one beautiful second before his hand closed around my arm and pulled me backward. I screamed, loud and raw, knowing there were no neighbors close enough to hear, but screaming anyway. He dragged me back into the living room and threw me onto the floor. He was stronger than he looked, much stronger, and his face had changed completely. That gentle, concerned expression was gone. His eyes were flat and empty, like he had switched something off inside himself. He stood over me and told me I should not have done that things could have been easy if I had just cooperated. He reached down to grab me again, and I did the only thing I could think of. I bit his hand as hard as I could, sinking my teeth into the flesh between his thumb and index finger until I tasted blood. He screamed and jerked back, and in that second I rolled sideways and got to my feet. There was a lamp on an end table near the couch, and I grabbed it without thinking, swinging it at his head as he lunged toward me. The base connected with his temple and he staggered, not falling but stumbling enough to give me a few seconds. I ran back toward the front door, but he had locked it again somehow. The deadbolt turned. The kitchen. I remembered the back door near the kitchen. I sprinted through the living room, knocking over a chair behind me to slow him down, and made it to the kitchen. The back door had a chain lock, a deadbolt, and a regular lock. My fingers fumbled with all 3 while I heard him coming, cursing and breathing heavy, his footsteps getting closer. The chain came off. The deadbolt turned. The regular lock clicked. I threw the door open and ran into the backyard, cold, wet grass under my feet, heading for the fence at the edge of the property. The fence was wooden, maybe 6 feet tall, and I hit it at full speed, grabbing the top and pulling myself up. I felt a hand close around my ankle, and I kicked backward as hard as I could, felt my heel connect with something solid. His grip loosened, and I hauled myself over the top, splinters digging into my palms, and dropped down the other side into an empty lot full of dead weeds and broken glass. I did not stop. I ran through the lot, across someone's driveway, down a street I did not recognize, just running until my lungs burned and my legs felt like they would collapse. I found a gas station about a mile away, the lights bright and welcoming, and I stumbled inside looking like a complete mess. Barefoot because I had lost my shoes somewhere, bleeding from my hands, crying and shaking. The woman behind the counter called the police. I told them everything. They went to the house, but Gary was gone. He had cleared out within hours, taken the monitors, taken anything that could identify him. The police said they would investigate, but I could tell from their faces they did not expect to find him. I spent 2 nights in a shelter after that, then got a bus ticket to another city. I never went back to Columbus. Nobody tells you how quiet the world gets after midnight when you sleep outside. My name is irrelevant now, but people used to call me Eddie back when I had a job installing drywall and a studio apartment in Tucson. That life ended somewhere between my second back surgery and the opioid prescription that insurance stopped covering. By the spring of 2024, my 36th birthday had come and gone without celebration, and I had been sleeping behind the recycling center on Conover Road for almost 8 months. I knew every shortcut in the city, every safe corner to rest, every business that would let me use their bathroom without hassle. I also knew which streets to avoid after dark, and that knowledge is what led me into that alley on the night everything changed. It was a Wednesday, I remember, because the shelter on 5th Avenue served hot soup on Wednesdays, and I had filled my stomach for the first time in 2 days. The Ridley Heights neighborhood had gotten bad over the past year. Drug deals happened openly on the corners, and 3 people had been shot there in the past month alone. I usually walked the long way around, adding 20 minutes to reach my sleeping spot, but that night my legs ached from walking all day looking for aluminum cans to recycle. The alley behind the old textile factory seemed like a reasonable compromise, a straight shot that would keep me off the main streets while cutting through the edge of the dangerous zone. I had used it maybe twice before without incident. The entrance sat between a shuttered pawn shop and a building that used to be a check cashing place, both covered in graffiti and protected by rusty security gates. A single streetlight flickered at the far end, casting orange shadows that jumped and twitched against the brick walls. I pulled my jacket tighter, adjusted the backpack that held everything I owned, and stepped into the darkness with nothing but the sound of my own footsteps for company. The alley stretched longer than I remembered, maybe 200 yards of cracked asphalt littered with broken bottles and fast food wrappers. Dumpsters lined the left side, overflowing with garbage that nobody had collected in weeks. The smell hit me about 30 feet in, that sour combination of rotting food and stagnant water pooling in potholes that never drained properly. I kept my head down and walked with purpose, the way you learn to move when you live on the streets. You never want to look lost or vulnerable. You never want to seem like an easy target. Halfway through, I passed a shopping cart wedged against a chain-link fence, its wheels stripped and rusted solid. Someone had abandoned it there months ago, and now it served as a landmark of sorts, a sign that I had reached the midpoint. That fence separated the alley from an empty lot where the city had torn down an old warehouse 2 years back. They never built anything new, just left it as a flat expanse of weeds and concrete rubble. I was about 20 feet past the shopping cart when I heard it. At first, I thought it was an animal, maybe a cat in distress or a dog whimpering somewhere in the lot. The sound was muffled, distant, coming from the other side of the fence. I slowed my pace but kept walking, telling myself it was none of my business. In my world, curiosity gets you killed or beaten or robbed. You learn to keep your eyes forward and your mouth shut. But the sound came again, louder this time, and I recognized it for what it was. A human voice. Someone crying out, the sound cut short like a hand had covered their mouth. I stopped walking. My heart began to pound against my ribs and I felt the sweat break out on my forehead despite the cool night air. Every instinct screamed at me to keep moving, to pretend I heard nothing, to get out of that alley and never look back. But my feet would not obey. I crept toward the fence, staying close to the dumpsters where the shadows were thickest. The chain link had holes in several places, torn open by vandals or maybe by people like me looking for a shortcut. Through one of these gaps I could see into the lot. The moon had emerged from behind the clouds, casting pale light across the weeds and broken concrete. At first I saw nothing, just empty space and the skeletal remains of the warehouse foundation. Then movement caught my eye near the far corner, maybe 50 yards from where I stood. 2 figures. No, 3. One on the ground. 2 standing over them. I squinted, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. One of the standing figures drew back his arm and swung something downward. The thud that followed was sickening, a wet, heavy sound that I had never heard before but understood immediately. The figure on the ground jerked and then went still. The other standing figure laughed, a short bark of amusement that echoed across the empty lot and reached my ears with terrible clarity. My body reacted before my mind could process what I had witnessed. I pressed myself flat against the dumpster, making myself as small as possible. Through the gap in the fence, I watched the 2 men step back from the motionless form on the ground. One was tall and heavy-set, wearing a dark hoodie with the sleeves pushed up to his elbows. The other was shorter, wiry, with a shaved head that gleamed in the moonlight. The tall one held something in his hand, a pipe or a bat. I could not tell which from that distance. He wiped it on his jeans and said something to his companion that I could not hear. The shorter man nodded and pulled out his phone, the screen lighting up his face with a ghostly blue glow. They seemed casual, unhurried, like they had all the time in the world. Like what they had just done was nothing more than a minor errand. The person on the ground had not moved since that final blow, and I knew with horrible certainty that I was looking at a body. I wanted to scream. I wanted to charge through that fence and tackle those men and somehow save whoever lay bleeding in the weeds. But I am not a hero. I am a 53-year-old man with a bad back and malnutrition and no weapon except a dull pocket knife I use to open cans. Those 2 would have killed me without breaking a sweat, and then there would be 2 bodies in that lot instead of 1. So I did the only thing I could do. I made myself breathe slowly, silently, fighting the urge to gasp for air. I counted to 10 in my head, then 20, waiting for them to leave. The tall one lit a cigarette, the flame from his lighter briefly illuminating a face with a crooked nose and a thick beard. He took a long drag and blew smoke toward the sky, completely relaxed. The shorter one finished whatever he was doing on his phone and shoved it back in his pocket. They exchanged a few more words, glanced down at the body one final time, and then began walking toward the opposite end of the lot where a gap in the perimeter fence led out to Dexter Street. I waited until they disappeared into the shadows on the far side. Then I waited another full minute, counting the seconds in my head, terrified that they might come back, or that one of them had spotted me somehow. When I finally moved, my legs felt like they belonged to someone else. I stumbled backward, away from the fence, my eyes still fixed on the dark shape lying motionless in the lot. Part of me wanted to go to them, to check if they were still alive, to do something. But a larger part understood that every second I stayed was a second wasted. Those men could return at any moment, or someone else might come along, find me near a body, and assume the worst. I knew how this worked. I knew who the cops would believe and who they would arrest. A homeless man covered in dirt, crouching near a murder victim in the middle of the night. I would spend the rest of my life in prison for a crime I did not commit. The only way to help was to find someone with a phone, someone who could call the police and send them to this exact spot before it was too late, if it was not too late already. I ran. Not the careful, measured walk I had learned to use on the streets, but a full desperate sprint toward the end of the alley. My backpack slammed against my spine with every step. My lungs burned from years of cigarettes and sleeping in cold air. I burst out onto Fremont Boulevard and looked wildly in both directions, searching for anyone. A car, a pedestrian, an open business. The street was empty. Shuttered storefronts lined both sides, their windows dark and protected by metal grates. I kept running, my boots pounding against the sidewalk until I spotted the glow of fluorescent lights half a block ahead. A 24-hour laundromat, the kind of place that stays open all night for shift workers and insomniacs. I crashed through the door so hard that the little bell above it nearly ripped from its mount. Inside, a woman in her 60s sat folding towels at one of the plastic tables. She looked up at me with wide eyes, her hands frozen mid-fold, and I realized how I must have appeared. Wild-eyed, sweating, gasping for breath, a homeless man bursting in like a lunatic in the middle of the night. I tried to speak, but the words came out in fragments. Someone hurt. In the lot. Behind the factory. "Call the police, please." The woman stared at me for what felt like an eternity, her expression caught somewhere between fear and confusion. I thought she might scream or run or tell me to get out, but something in my face must have convinced her, because she slowly reached into her purse and pulled out a cell phone. Her name was Maxine, I learned later, and she had worked the night shift at a packaging plant for 30 years before retiring. She dialed 911 with steady fingers while I leaned against a washing machine and tried not to collapse. I heard her describe the location, repeat it when the dispatcher asked for clarification, then hand the phone to me. The voice on the other end was calm, professional, asking questions I struggled to answer. How many attackers? What did they look like? Was the victim still breathing? I told them everything I could remember. The tall one with the beard, the short one with the shaved head, the weapon that might have been a pipe or a bat. I told them the men had walked toward Dexter Street. I told them to hurry, please hurry, because someone was dying in that empty lot while we stood here talking. The police arrived at the laundromat 14 minutes after the call. I know because I watched the clock on the wall the entire time, each minute stretching into something unbearable. 2 officers took my statement while Maxine made instant coffee in styrofoam cups and handed them out like we were at some grim midnight gathering. They asked me the same questions the dispatcher had asked, then asked them again in different ways, looking for inconsistencies. I understood. I was a witness without an address, without identification, without anything to prove I was telling the truth. One of the officers drove me back to the lot in his patrol car. More police had already arrived, their red and blue lights painting the surrounding buildings in pulsing color. Yellow tape stretched across the gap in the fence. I watched from the back seat as paramedics emerged from the lot carrying a stretcher. The body on it was covered with a white sheet. Nobody was rushing. Nobody was performing CPR or shouting orders. They moved with the slow, deliberate pace of people who had arrived too late. The officer beside me said something, maybe an attempt at comfort, but I did not hear the words. All I could think about was the sound of that final blow, the wet thud that would echo in my skull for years to come. They found the two men 3 days later. Someone had talked, a girlfriend or a neighbor, or maybe just someone who wanted the reward money that the victim's family had posted. The tall one's name was Carl Denning, 41 years old, 3 prior convictions for assault. The shorter one was his cousin, a 26-year-old named Ricky Slade, who had been in and out of county jail since he turned 18. The victim was a 23-year-old college student named James Okonkwo, who had been walking home from his job at a warehouse. Wrong place, wrong time, wrong neighborhood. The detectives told me that my description helped narrow down the suspects, that my willingness to come forward made a difference. But it did not feel like a difference. James Okonkwo was still dead. His mother still had to identify his body. His friends still had to bury him. I did what I could, and it was not enough. And I have carried that weight every single day since. Some nights I still wake up in whatever doorway or shelter bed I have found, gasping for air, hearing that laugh echo across an empty lot. I tell myself I made the right choice. I tell myself that going in there would have just gotten me killed too. But the truth is, I will never know if I could have saved him. I will never know if 30 seconds of courage might have changed everything. And that uncertainty, that permanent maybe, is the thing that haunts me more than anything those two men could have done to my body. At that point in my life, I was staying at a women's shelter on the edge of town, trying to keep my days structured so I didn't spiral. Mornings were about lining up early, keeping my clothes clean, and checking the bulletin board for anything that paid cash. That day started the same way, with weak coffee and the smell of disinfectant clinging to everything I owned. I headed out before sunrise toward a day labor pickup spot near an old gas station where contractors sometimes showed up. Most days you waited for hours and went home empty-handed, but hope had a way of making you stand there anyway. I kept telling myself I just needed one small break to get back on my feet. Rent deposits, bus passes, and cheap motels all felt impossibly far away. That morning felt ordinary enough to be forgettable. I didn't realize how carefully I would remember every detail later. While we were waiting, a man parked across the street and watched the line for a while without getting out. He looked clean, well-fed, and out of place compared to the rest of us. After a few minutes, he walked over and said he needed help cleaning a house he was preparing to sell. He spoke calmly, said it would only take a few hours, and promised cash at the end of the day. No paperwork, no questions, just simple cleaning. He looked directly at me when he spoke, like he had already decided. I hesitated, but the others were already shaking their heads or backing away. Something about how quickly he singled me out should have mattered more. Instead, I focused on the idea of money in my pocket by nightfall. I agreed before I gave myself time to talk out of it. The drive didn't take long, but the scenery changed faster than I expected. Houses thinned out, streetlights disappeared, and the road narrowed until it felt forgotten. He didn't talk much, just made small comments about the weather and traffic like we were co-workers. When we pulled up, the house sat alone near a line of trees with no neighboring homes close enough to see us. The place looked empty in a way that felt intentional, not abandoned. No cars, no trash bins, no curtains in the windows. He unlocked the door and gestured for me to go in first. The air inside smelled stale, like dust and old wood, not like a place being actively prepared for sale. I asked where the cleaning supplies were, trying to sound casual. That's when he closed the door behind us and didn't answer. At first I assumed there was a misunderstanding and tried to keep things light. I said I could leave and come back later if this wasn't a good time. He stepped between me and the door without raising his voice, saying we needed to talk first. The way he blocked the exit felt deliberate, like he had rehearsed the movement. I noticed then how quiet the house was. No hum of appliances, no distant traffic, nothing. My phone had no signal, just a blank bar at the top of the screen. He told me there was no cleaning job and asked questions that had nothing to do with work. Each answer I gave seemed to encourage him to stand closer. I realized then that leaving calmly wasn't an option. Whatever this was, it was already moving in a direction I couldn't afford to follow. I tried to slow everything down by talking, asking questions that didn't matter, pretending this was still a normal conversation. My voice sounded steadier than I felt, like it belonged to someone braver. He started circling the room, explaining how the house used to belong to family, how nobody came out this far anymore. He kept mentioning how people disappeared into routines, and how easy it was for someone to be forgotten. Each sentence landed heavier than the last. I edged toward a hallway, pretending to look for a bathroom, just needing space to think. He noticed immediately and told me not to wander. That was when the fear stopped being abstract and became physical, pressing behind my ribs. I understood that every minute I stayed passive made things worse. The hallway led to empty rooms with bare floors and nothing on the walls, like the house had been stripped on purpose. I noticed the windows were nailed shut from the outside, the wood splintered and uneven. The back door had a metal latch I couldn't open from my side. When I returned to the main room, he was watching me with the patience of someone waiting for a clock to run out. He told me I could sit down, that no one was in a hurry. My phone buzzed with a low battery warning, which felt cruel. I asked to use the bathroom again, this time sounding desperate, and he nodded too quickly. As I walked away, I realized he trusted the house more than he needed to watch me. That was the first opening I saw. In the bathroom, the mirror was cracked down the middle, splitting my face into two uneven versions of myself. I locked the door and scanned the room for anything useful. The window was small but not sealed like the others, just painted shut. I grabbed the towel rack and yanked until the screws tore out of the wall. The noise echoed through the house, followed by his footsteps moving fast. I smashed the window with the metal bar, ignoring the sting of glass on my arm. Cold air rushed in, sharp and real. He started shouting, telling me to stop, telling me I was making a mistake. I didn't stop. I climbed halfway out before he reached the door. The drop outside was awkward but survivable, and I hit the ground hard enough to knock the breath out of me. I didn't look back. My legs moved on instinct, tearing through brush and uneven ground toward the road I remembered. Branches scratched my face and my shoes filled with dirt, but I kept going. When I reached the pavement, a car slowed, the driver staring at me like I was something pulled out of a nightmare. I waved my arms and collapsed onto the shoulder, words tumbling out too fast to make sense. The driver called for help and stayed with me until others arrived. Later, authorities went to the house and found it empty again, like it had already decided to erase itself. I still think about how close I came to being just another person no one noticed missing. The shelter took me back that night without asking many questions, just handed me a blanket and a cup of soup that shook in my hands. I didn't sleep at all. Every time someone walked past my bunk, my body tensed, expecting to see him standing there like he had been waiting. The next morning, a caseworker sat with me in a small office and wrote everything down while I talked. Saying it out loud made it sound unreal, like I was describing a movie I barely remembered watching. She told me I did the right thing, that predators often looked for people who wouldn't be missed right away. That sentence stayed with me longer than anything else. It wasn't meant to hurt, but it did. A few days later, an officer came by to ask more questions. They showed me photos of houses on the outskirts of town, trying to see if any looked familiar. None of them did. The place I remembered didn't seem to exist anymore, at least not on paper. He explained that sometimes people used empty properties temporarily, moving on before anyone caught on. There wasn't much they could do without an exact location. Hearing that made my chest feel hollow. It meant he was still out there, looking for someone else. The officer suggested I avoid day labor spots for a while and stick close to places with cameras and staff. That advice felt small compared to what had happened, but I took it seriously. I eventually found steady work through a church program, cleaning offices during the evening. It wasn't glamorous, but it came with people around and locked doors that opened from the inside. Every time a man spoke too softly or stood too close, My body reacted before my mind did. I learned how to trust that reaction without letting it control me. I started saving again, slow and careful. I also started talking to other women at the shelter, sharing what happened without details that could scare them away from hope. I told them to listen to the moments that felt wrong even if nothing obvious was happening. Those conversations mattered more than I expected. Posting this now isn't about closure so much as clarity. That day taught me how thin the line is between survival and disappearance, especially when you're already on the margins. I don't know what his plan was or how far it might have gone, and maybe that's for the best. What I do know is that leaving when I did changed everything. I'm in a small apartment now, nothing special, but the door locks and the windows open freely. Some nights I still dream about that house and wake up counting exits. Other nights I sleep through until morning, and that feels like a victory I earned the hard way. At the time, life had narrowed down to whatever fit inside my backpack and whatever kindness the night decided to offer. Sleeping came in fragments, usually on benches or behind closed storefronts, and most days blurred together in a quiet fight to stay clean enough not to draw attention. That evening had been colder than usual, the kind that creeps through thin fabric and settles into your bones. A gas station on the edge of town glowed like a small island of safety, fluorescent lights humming and buzzing insects trapped against the glass. I went in because I needed water and a place to rinse my face. Nothing more ambitious than that. My reflection in the restroom mirror barely looked like someone with a past, just a man with tired eyes and cracked lips. The sink sputtered before giving me lukewarm water, and even that felt like a gift. For a few minutes, the world outside stopped pressing in. The restroom smelled like disinfectant layered over something older and sour, the kind of smell that never fully leaves. I leaned against the wall, letting the quiet wrap around me, counting my breaths until the ache in my feet eased. There was no clock inside, just the faint music from the store speakers bleeding through the walls. At some point, the music stopped, replaced by the sharp clatter of metal somewhere near the front. A heavy thud hit the door, followed by another, louder this time, rattling the handle. Someone yelled something muffled, words lost through steel and echo. I pulled the handle instinctively and felt the resistance immediately. The lock had shifted, solid and final, like a decision already made. Panic didn't arrive all at once. It trickled in, slow and humiliating. I knocked back, trying to keep my voice steady as I called out that someone was inside. The pounding answered me again, quicker, then stopped altogether. Silence settled in so deeply I could hear my own breathing bouncing off the tile. The light stayed on, but the building felt hollow, emptied of people and intent. No phone sat in my pocket, no bottle of water on the sink, nothing that tied me to anyone outside that room. Time stretched in strange ways, minutes swelling into something heavier. Hunger gave way to thirst, and thirst became the only thing I could think about. Every sound from the street felt distant, like it belonged to another version of the world. Hours passed with nothing but the hum of the lights and my own thoughts turning sharp. Sitting on the floor, I realized how invisible I had become, how easy it was for a place to lock up and forget someone like me existed. If something had happened in there, there wouldn't have been a name called out or a number dialed. The door didn't care who leaned against it or how long they stayed quiet. That understanding hit harder than the locked handle or the dry mouth ever could. When the morning finally came and the door opened, the clerk looked startled, then embarrassed, then relieved all at once. I stepped back into daylight, changed in a way that's hard to explain. Since then, I've never stopped thinking about how close disappearing really is, and how no one would have known if I had. The moment the door opened, light flooded in like it had weight, and I had to shield my eyes. The clerk kept apologizing, saying the lock must have caught by mistake, saying they never checked the restroom before closing. I nodded because that was easier than explaining anything. My legs felt weak standing up, pins and needles shooting through my feet as if they didn't belong to me anymore. I asked for water and drank it too fast, spilling some down my chin, not caring how it looked. People stared for a second and then went back to their own routines, coffee cups and lottery tickets, morning already swallowing the night. No one asked how long I'd been in there. No one asked if I was okay. I stepped outside and sat on the curb, letting the cold concrete ground me. Cars came and went, engines starting, doors slamming, the normal rhythm of a day beginning. From the outside, the place looked harmless. Just another gas station people forget the moment they pull away. I kept thinking about the lock, how a small turn of metal had erased me from the building without anyone noticing. If I hadn't knocked, if the clerk hadn't opened up when they did, the story could have gone very differently. The thought stayed lodged in my chest, heavy and uncomfortable. I watched the sky lighten and wondered how many times this kind of thing happens without an ending. Later that day, I tried to go about things like normal, but everything felt sharper. Thirst came back quickly, my throat reminding me how fragile the body really is. Every closed door suddenly felt like a risk instead of shelter. I replayed the sounds in my head, the pounding, the sudden quiet, the way the air felt stale after hours with no movement. It wasn't just fear anymore, it was clarity. Being homeless doesn't just mean lacking a place to sleep. It means existing on the edge of other people's attention. The moment that attention slips, you're alone with whatever happens next. That night, I didn't go looking for enclosed spaces. I stayed where I could see the sky, where doors couldn't decide my fate. The experience didn't turn me into a different person overnight, but it stripped something away. I understood how easily I could vanish inside a locked room, a stairwell, a forgotten corner of a building. Since then, I pay attention to exits, to sounds, to the simple fact of being seen. The world didn't change after that day, but I did. And even now, when I pass a gas station late at night, I remember how close I came to becoming a story no one ever told. In the days that followed, the memory kept resurfacing at strange moments. Washing my hands at a public sink made my chest tighten. Hearing a lock click somewhere nearby pulled my attention instantly. I caught myself studying doors, hinges, the way handles sat in their frames, like they were clues to something dangerous. It wasn't paranoia so much as awareness sharpened by experience. People walked past me every day, close enough that I could smell their laundry soap or their coffee, yet none of them knew how close I'd come to being sealed away overnight. I realized how thin the line was between being part of the world and being forgotten inside it. I eventually told another guy on the street about what happened, someone who'd been out there longer than me. He listened quietly, nodding, not surprised at all. He said something that stuck with me, that buildings don't see people, only schedules. Closing time doesn't care who's still inside. That idea haunted me more than the locked door ever did. Systems run smoothly because they aren't built to notice individuals like us. If you fall outside the expected flow, you're just an error that goes unreported. Standing there, I understood that the scariest part wasn't the fear or the thirst, but how normal the situation was. I started making small changes after that. I avoided going anywhere without at least knowing how many exits there were. If I went into a restroom, I paid attention to sounds, footsteps, keys jangling. I asked clerks questions I never would have asked before, just to make sure someone had seen me. It felt awkward, sometimes embarrassing, but staying invisible suddenly felt far worse. I didn't want my existence to depend on whether someone remembered to check a door. Those hours trapped inside that room rewired how I moved through the world. Cautious but alert. Nothing dramatic came out of it in the end. No report, no apology letter, no consequence beyond my own memory. Life went on the same way it always does for people like me, one day bleeding into the next. But I carry that night with me as proof of how close disappearing really is. If I hadn't spoken up, if timing had been slightly different, there wouldn't have been a story to post here at all. I'm sharing this because it happened, because it could happen again, and because some people only exist as long as someone remembers they're there. During the winter I'm talking about, my life had shrunk down to a backpack, a prepaid phone, and whatever space I could claim without being noticed. I wasn't living on the street exactly, not in the way people imagine, but I wasn't stable either. I worked odd hours cleaning offices after they closed, paid in cash, and slept wherever I could stay dry and unseen. That storage facility became my compromise with reality. Renting a small unit felt like a loophole, something almost clever, a place with cameras, fences, and rules that kept most people away at night. I told myself it was temporary, just until I saved enough for a room somewhere. That night started like any other, quiet, routine, almost boring in a way that made me relax more than I should have. The unit I used was narrow and smelled like dust and old cardboard, with a concrete floor that held the cold no matter how many layers I wore. I arranged my things with military precision so nothing scraped or rattled if I shifted my weight. The metal door, when lowered just enough, left a slit of air that felt like breathing through clenched teeth. I always waited until the facility went dark before settling in, listening for the distant hum of traffic and the occasional clank of someone leaving late. That evening, the silence felt heavier, like the building itself was holding its breath. I remember thinking it might rain, the way the air pressed against my ears. Sometime after I laid down, the stillness broke in a way that didn't belong. Footsteps echoed down the row, slow and deliberate, not the hurried pace of someone grabbing boxes before closing. Each step had weight to it, the sound bouncing off the metal doors in uneven rhythm. Then came the unmistakable grind of a lock being turned and a unit door lifting nearby. I counted the seconds between movements without meaning to, my mind cataloging every sound like it was evidence. Whoever it was didn't rush, didn't fumble, didn't curse under their breath. That scared me more than anything else could have. Without warning, the overhead light snapped on, flooding the corridor with harsh white glare that seeped through the crack under my door. My heart hammered so hard I was sure it had a sound of its own. Shadows moved across the concrete as someone walked past, stopping occasionally, testing locks one by one. I could hear the faint click of metal and the soft scrape of fingers along door handles. My thoughts split in two directions at once. Stay perfectly still and hope I blended into the building, or take the risk of slipping out while the noise masked me. Every instinct argued with the other, and the space around me felt suddenly too small to breathe. I pressed myself against the back wall, pulling my jacket tighter, trying to control the noise of my breathing without thinking about it too much. The footsteps stopped right outside my unit, close enough that I could see the shadow of shoes through the gap. There was a pause that stretched longer than it should have, followed by the soft rattle of my lock being tested. It didn't open, but the sound of it being touched made my chest ache. Whoever was out there leaned close enough that I caught the faint smell of oil and something sharp, almost medicinal. I realized then how thin the metal door really was, how little separated me from being discovered. The person moved on, checking the next unit, then the next, following a pattern that felt methodical instead of random. I shifted my weight carefully, inch by inch, making sure nothing brushed the floor. Sweat gathered at the base of my neck despite the cold, and my legs tingled from staying too still. Through the crack, I could see flashes of movement as the figure passed under each light. The way they stopped, listened, and then continued told me this wasn't casual. This was someone making sure everything was exactly how they expected it to be. A low voice carried down the row, not loud enough to make out words, but close enough to know someone else might be on the phone or using a radio. That changed everything. One person was terrifying, but the idea of more than one made the air feel heavier. I thought about the exit at the far end, about how far it was, about how loud the gravel sounded under shoes. Staying hidden meant trusting that my presence hadn't already been noticed. Leaving meant stepping into the open under full light, gambling that speed would beat attention. When the footsteps moved farther away, I slowly lifted the door another inch, just enough to see the corridor clearly. The lights hummed overhead, and at the far end, a figure stood near the office, clipboard in hand, checking something against a list. Another person emerged from between units, nodding as they passed each other. That was the moment I decided. I waited until both of them turned away, then slipped out, keeping low, closing the door as softly as possible. Every step toward the exit felt like it echoed, but no one called out. I didn't stop moving until I was beyond the fence, lungs burning, hands numb, carrying everything I owned on my back. I didn't go far at first, just enough to put distance between me and that building. I sat behind a row of dumpsters across the road, knees pulled in, watching the facility from the shadows. The light stayed on longer than usual, and I saw one of them walk the perimeter fence with a flashlight, sweeping the beam along the ground and the gate. It hit the spot where I'd slipped through not long before, paused there, then moved on. That pause told me everything I needed to know. If I had stayed inside, if I'd hesitated even a little longer, I don't think I would have walked out on my own. I waited until the lights finally shut off again before moving. My hands were stiff, and my shoulders ached from tension more than from the cold. I took a longer route away from the area, sticking to side streets, listening for engines slowing down or footsteps changing pace behind me. Every sound felt amplified, like my body was still trapped in that narrow unit. I didn't sleep at all that night. I just kept walking, stopping only when my legs threatened to give out, replaying the sequence of sounds in my head over and over. The next day, I went back during regular hours, trying to look like a normal customer with a reason to be there. I packed my things fast, avoiding eye contact, half expecting someone to stop me or ask questions. No one did. The office clerk barely glanced up. That normalcy was unsettling in its own way. I dropped the key in the slot, walked out, and didn't look back. I didn't argue with myself about it or tell myself I was overreacting. I knew better after what I'd heard and seen. I never slept in another storage unit again. I found a different arrangement not long after, one that didn't rely on being invisible. Even now, when I hear metal doors rolling up or locks clicking into place, my body reacts before my mind does. I don't know who those people were or what would have happened if I'd stayed hidden until they reached my door. What I do know is that trusting that place to keep me safe almost cost me the only thing I had left, the ability to walk away,